By sunrise, people in Berlin would discover that a journey of 30 seconds had become impossible. A doorway would open onto a forbidden street. A grandmother would wake to find her grandchildren living in another world. A young man would look from an apartment window and realize that the pavement below was no longer simply pavement. It was now a frontier guarded by soldiers. But that morning was still 16 years away. Before Berlin was divided by concrete, it was divided by armies. Before the watchtowers and searchlights, before the barbed wire and checkpoints, before the tunnels beneath the streets and the desperate flights across rooftops, there was another Berlin entirely. A Berlin of broken windows, burned buildings, collapsed bridges, and exhausted people emerging from cellars into the spring of 1945. The city had survived a dictatorship, years of bombing, and one of the most destructive battles ever fought in Europe. Now, with Adolf Hitler dead and Nazi Germany defeated, the victors arrived to decide what would happen next. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union had fought together against a common enemy. Yet almost as soon as that enemy disappeared, their alliance began to cool. They disagreed about Germany. They disagreed about Europe. And beneath those disagreements was a larger question that would shape the lives of hundreds of millions of people. What should the world look like after the war? Berlin became the place where that question could not remain theoretical. Although the city lay deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, Berlin itself was divided among 4 Allied powers. American soldiers could stand only a short distance from Soviet troops. British administrators worked in one district, while communist officials reorganized another. Trains crossed invisible political boundaries. Families lived on one side and worked on the other. At first, there was no wall. People walked across the dividing lines almost without noticing them. Then came different newspapers, different currencies, different police forces, different governments, different versions of the future. And slowly, almost quietly, the lines on the occupation maps began moving into ordinary life. Over the next 16 years, millions of East Germans would leave for the West, many of them through Berlin. Doctors disappeared from hospitals, engineers abandoned factories, students boarded trains and did not return. Entire families departed with little more than a suitcase. Eventually, the East German government would decide that the open door had to be closed. And in the darkness before dawn on August 13, 1961, soldiers would begin unrolling barbed wire through the streets of a sleeping city. That wire would become fences. The fences would become walls. And the walls would stand for 28 years. Tonight, we will follow their entire story. From the ashes of 1945 to the Berlin airlift, from the 1st Division of Germany to the night the border closed, from secret tunnels beneath the city to surveillance inside East German homes, from watchtowers and escape attempts to candlelit demonstrations and a confused press conference that helped bring an entire political order crashing down. This is the story of the Berlin Wall. But to understand why anyone believed such a wall had to exist, we must begin in a city where almost everything else had already been destroyed. In the spring of 1945, Berlin sounded different. The familiar sounds of a European capital had almost disappeared. There were few ordinary automobiles. Few streetcars followed their complete routes. Shop doors did not open each morning as they once had. Factory whistles no longer organized the day with the same confidence. Instead, there was artillery. There were collapsing buildings. There were military vehicles grinding over streets covered with shattered masonry. And there was the long, deep thunder of a war finally arriving at the capital of the regime that had begun it. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised Germans that victory remained possible. Even as Allied armies approached from the west and the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east, official statements continued to speak of resistance, sacrifice, and miraculous reversals. But by April 1945, reality had entered Berlin. The Soviet offensive toward the city began with overwhelming force. East of Berlin, vast formations of troops, tanks, guns, and aircraft pushed toward the German capital. The remaining German defenders included regular soldiers, members of the SS, police units, elderly men from the Volkssturm militia, and teenagers who had been pulled into a battle whose outcome was already decided. The city became a fortress in name. In practice, it became a trap. Civilians crowded into cellars and underground shelters. Families carried blankets, jars of preserved food, buckets of water, and whatever possessions they could manage below ground. People learned to identify the distance of explosions by sound. They slept in clothing because there might not be time to dress when the next bombardment began. Above them, Berlin was being torn apart. Apartment blocks burned. Windows vanished. Roofs collapsed inward. Streets became barriers of broken stone. Telephone lines failed. Water pipes burst. Railway stations filled with smoke, soldiers, refugees, and fear. The final battle moved from district to district, sometimes from building to building. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler killed himself in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. 2 days later, Berlin surrendered to Soviet forces. The fighting in Europe ended soon afterward. Germany's unconditional surrender was signed in early May, and a war that had devastated the continent finally came to an end. But peace did not immediately feel peaceful. For the people of Berlin, the first days after the fighting were not filled with celebrations. They were filled with survival. Imagine stepping out of a cellar after days underground. The air carries the smell of smoke, damp stone, sewage, and burned timber. Dust lies across the street. A building that stood opposite your home for your entire life is now open to the sky. Rooms are visible from the outside, as if the front wall of a dollhouse has been removed. A bed hangs partly over a collapsed floor. Wallpaper remains attached to a wall that no longer protects anyone from the weather. A framed photograph is somehow still hanging above a fireplace. And through the ruins, people begin walking. They are searching for water, searching for food, searching for relatives, searching for any official notice that might explain what is supposed to happen next. The government they had known had disappeared. The army had surrendered. The police system was being reorganized. The currency was unstable. Transportation had broken down. Millions of displaced people were moving across Europe. And Berlin, once the center of one of the most powerful states on the continent, was now an occupied city. Soviet troops had taken Berlin during the battle, but the wartime agreements among the Allies had already established that Germany would not simply become Soviet territory. The defeated country was to be divided into occupation zones. The Soviet Union would control the eastern zone. The United States, Britain, and France would control zones in the west. Berlin presented a special problem. The city was located well inside the Soviet occupation zone, more than 100 miles from the western occupation areas. Yet Berlin itself was also to be divided. The Soviet Union controlled the eastern sector of the city. The Americans occupied districts in the southwest. The British took sectors in the west. The French administered districts in the northwest. This arrangement created one of the strangest political geographies of the 20th century. A divided city inside a divided country. And eventually, part of that city would become a Western political outpost, surrounded entirely by territory controlled by the Soviet Union, and later, East Germany. In 1945, however, the consequences were not yet obvious. There was no Berlin Wall. There was no Federal Republic of Germany. There was no German Democratic Republic. There was not yet even a Cold War in the form later generations would recognize. There were simply occupation sectors, military governments, checkpoints, damaged streets, and 4 victorious powers attempting to administer the wreckage of a defeated state. For ordinary Berliners, the immediate concerns were smaller. Food was scarce. Fuel was scarce. Housing was desperately scarce. Entire neighborhoods had suffered severe damage, leaving countless people crowded into surviving apartments. Families sometimes lived in rooms with missing windows covered by wood or cloth. Others occupied buildings whose upper floors were unsafe. When winter approached, the question of coal became urgent. Without fuel, there would be no heat. Without functioning transportation, even available supplies could be difficult to distribute. People traded what they owned. A watch might be exchanged for food. Jewelry might become potatoes. Clothing might become cigarettes. Cigarettes themselves became a kind of informal currency in many transactions. Urban gardens appeared wherever soil was available. People grew vegetables in spaces that had once been ornamental or unused. Anything edible had value. Across ruined streets, civilians began clearing mountains of debris. The image of the Trümmerfrauen, the so-called rubble women, later became one of the most famous symbols of post-war Germany. Women certainly played a visible role in clearing and sorting debris, particularly in a society where so many men were dead, missing, wounded, or prisoners of war. The larger process of reconstruction involved many kinds of labor, but the sight of women passing bricks from hand to hand became part of the memory of those years. A brick could be cleaned. Mortar could be scraped away. The brick could be stacked. And one day, perhaps, it could become part of a building again. There was something almost painfully simple about the work. Stone by stone. Bucket by bucket. Street by street. Berlin began the long process of becoming habitable. But physical reconstruction was only one part of the problem. There was also the question of what kind of Germany would rise from the ruins. The four occupying powers had agreed on some basic principles. Germany would be demilitarized. Nazism would be dismantled. War criminals would be prosecuted. German political life would eventually be rebuilt. Yet behind those broad agreements were very different visions. For the Soviet Union, the war against Nazi Germany had been catastrophic on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Tens of millions of Soviet citizens had died. Cities and villages had been destroyed. Agricultural land had been devastated. The German invasion had reached deep into Soviet territory and had been accompanied by atrocities of enormous scale. Soviet leaders were determined that Germany would never again become capable of launching such an invasion. Security was not an abstract question for them. It was written across destroyed cities, mass graves, and millions of empty places at family tables. Joseph Stalin wanted political arrangements in Eastern Europe that would protect the Soviet Union from another attack from the West. Governments friendly to Moscow were taking shape across countries occupied by the Red Army. From the Soviet perspective, this could be described as a defensive belt. From the Western perspective, it increasingly looked like expansion. The United States had emerged from the war economically powerful and militarily dominant, possessing the atomic bomb until the Soviet Union developed its own several years later. American leaders wanted a stable European recovery and, increasingly, feared that economic chaos would make communist movements stronger. Britain had fought the war at enormous cost and remained determined to preserve a balance of power in Europe. France, still recovering from occupation, wanted security against any future German threat, while also resisting Soviet political influence. These powers had defeated Hitler together, but they had not become alike. Their political systems were different. Their economic systems were different. Their ideas about freedom, security, elections, property, and the future of Europe were different. As long as Nazi Germany remained the common enemy, those disagreements could be postponed. Now the common enemy was gone, and the disagreements remained. Berlin was where they became impossible to ignore. At first, the boundaries between occupation sectors could seem surprisingly ordinary. A person might live in one sector and have relatives in another. Public transportation still connected much of the city. Workers crossed sector boundaries. Berliners continued to think of themselves as residents of one city, despite the foreign uniforms appearing in different districts. But political life was changing. In the Soviet zone, communist leaders who had spent the Nazi years in exile began returning to Germany. Among them was Walter Ulbricht, a disciplined German communist who had lived in the Soviet Union and would later become one of the most important leaders of East Germany. The Soviet authorities encouraged the reconstruction of political parties, but they also worked to ensure that political development followed a direction acceptable to Moscow. In 1946, the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party in the Soviet occupation zone were merged into the Socialist Unity Party, known by its German initials, SED. The circumstances of that merger remained deeply controversial. Communist leaders presented it as a necessary unification of the workers' movement. Many Social Democrats experienced intense pressure and opposed being absorbed into a communist-dominated organization. The new SED would eventually become the ruling party of East Germany. In the Western sectors, politics developed differently. Competing parties operated under a more pluralistic system. Economic policies also began moving in another direction. These differences were still young, but they were becoming visible. A Berlin resident did not need to understand global strategy to notice them. Newspapers told different stories depending on where they were printed. Radio broadcasts carried different interpretations of events. Political posters used different words. Schools began teaching different assumptions about Germany's future. Police institutions developed under different authorities. Even language slowly became political. Words such as democracy, fascism, peace, freedom, capitalism, and socialism did not mean exactly the same thing when spoken from opposite sides of the city. And beneath everything was the question of responsibility for the recent past. Berlin had been the capital of Nazi Germany. Government ministries had planned wars from the city. Officials had helped administer persecution and mass murder from offices there. Now the symbols of the regime were being removed. Swastikas disappeared from public buildings. Nazi organizations were abolished. Officials were questioned about their political histories. The surviving leaders of the regime faced war crimes trials in Nuremberg. For Germans, the process of confronting what had happened would be long, uneven, painful, and incomplete. Many people were absorbed by immediate hardship. Some insisted they had known little. Some understood far more than they admitted. Some had resisted the dictatorship. Some had benefited from it. Some had lost relatives in German military service. Others had returned from concentration camps to neighborhoods where former persecutors still lived. The city contained victims, perpetrators, bystanders, survivors, refugees, soldiers, widows, children, and people who fit uneasily into several categories at once. History did not divide them cleanly. Neither would the future. During 1945 and 1946, the Allied relationship continued to deteriorate. Arguments arose over reparations, industrial production, political reforms, and the economic future of Germany. The Soviet Union had suffered immense destruction and sought reparations from its occupation zone, removing industrial equipment and other resources. Western policymakers increasingly worried that a weakened Germany could become economically unstable and politically vulnerable. They began thinking less about punishment and more about reconstruction. This shift was part of something larger. Across Europe, the wartime alliance was becoming a rivalry. In March 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a speech in the United States describing an iron curtain descending across the European continent. The phrase captured a division that was becoming clearer by the month. Eastern European governments were increasingly aligned with Moscow. Western European states were turning toward the United States for economic and military support. And Berlin sat exactly where those worlds touched. The strange thing was that daily life continued. People fell in love. Children returned to school. Cafes reopened in damaged buildings. Musicians played again. Streetcars resumed portions of their routes. Theaters performed for audiences sitting in a city that sometimes lacked enough coal to keep homes warm. Weddings took place. Babies were born. Families argued about politics over thin meals. People laughed. That may be one of the most important things to remember about cities during great historical transitions. People do not experience history as a continuous sequence of important dates. They experience mornings, work shifts, queues, cold rooms, missing relatives, a rumor heard on a tram, a newspaper headline glimpsed at a kiosk. a soldier standing at an intersection where no soldier stood the year before. In Berlin, the future did not arrive all at once. It arrived gradually, through thousands of small changes. One month, a new administrative rule. Another month, a different political poster. Then a new currency discussion. Then an argument over access routes. Then another dispute among the occupying powers. Each event added another almost invisible layer to the separation. The city still had no wall. A person could still cross from the Soviet sector into the American, British, or French sectors through ordinary streets and rail connections. But something was already happening. The occupation boundaries were becoming political boundaries. Political boundaries were becoming economic boundaries. Economic boundaries were becoming psychological boundaries. People began looking east and west and imagining different futures. And by 1947, the conflict was becoming much harder to disguise. The United States announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging support to countries resisting communist pressure. The Marshall Plan offered large-scale American assistance for European economic recovery. The Soviet Union regarded these policies with deep suspicion and prevented the countries under its control from participating in the Marshall Plan. Western occupation zones in Germany became increasingly integrated with the economies of Western Europe. The Soviet zone moved more firmly towards centralized socialist planning. Two systems were forming. Two alliances were beginning to emerge. Two versions of Germany were becoming imaginable. And between them stood Berlin, a city that neither side was willing to abandon. For the Soviet Union, Western control of parts of Berlin was an uncomfortable presence deep inside its zone of occupation. For the Western powers, remaining in Berlin was becoming a test of political resolve. For Berliners, the implications were more personal. Would food continue arriving? Would trains keep running? Could relatives still visit? Would the city ever be governed by Germans again? Would Germany remain one country? No one could answer with certainty. Then, in 1948, a decision about money would bring all of these tensions to the surface. The Western powers prepared a currency reform for their occupation areas. A new German mark was intended to replace the badly weakened Reichsmark and help revive economic life. The Soviet leadership saw the move as another step toward creating a separate West German state. The dispute quickly spread to Berlin. And soon, the roads, railways, and canals connecting the western sectors of the city with the outside world would be closed. A city that had survived bombs and artillery would face a new kind of siege. This time, the weapons would not be exploding shells. They would be blocked railway lines, empty coal yards, food inventories, electrical power, and the question of whether more than 2 million people in West Berlin could be supplied from the sky. The first great confrontation of the Cold War was about to begin, and above the ruined rooftops of Berlin, the sound of aircraft would soon return, not to drop bombs, but bread, coal, medicine, and a message that neither side intended to leave. In the summer of 1948, Berlin began to listen to the sky. Not for bombers, not for artillery, not for the engines of war returning to finish what had already been destroyed. This time, the sound above the city meant flour, coal, milk, medicine, salt, fuel, and survival. Every few minutes, another aircraft descended through the air over West Berlin, carrying the supplies that a city of more than 2 million people could no longer receive by road, railway, or canal. The war had been over for 3 years, but Berlin was already becoming the front line of another conflict. A quieter conflict at first. One fought through currencies, borders, political systems, newspaper headlines, economic plans, and access routes. No armies were yet charging across Europe. No great battle had begun. But the wartime alliance was dead, and the Cold War was becoming real. The crisis had been growing for years. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, the 4 occupying powers had promised to administer Germany together. On paper, this sounded possible. In In practice, almost every major question produced disagreement. How much industry should Germany be allowed to rebuild? How much should be removed as reparations? Should Germany become a unified country again? If so, what political system should it have? Should its economy be based on private property and markets, or centralized planning under state control? And perhaps most importantly, which side would influence the future of a country sitting directly in the center of Europe? For the Soviet Union, the answer was inseparable from security. German armies had invaded Russian and Soviet territory twice within a generation. The second invasion had brought destruction on a nearly unimaginable scale. Entire cities had been devastated. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died. The Soviet leadership wanted guarantees that Germany would never again become a military threat. A friendly, politically controlled Germany on the Soviet Union's western frontier seemed one way to obtain that security. The Western powers viewed the problem differently. The United States increasingly believed that economic recovery was essential to political stability. A ruined Germany, permanently impoverished and politically uncertain, could destabilize all of Western Europe. American officials worried that poverty and social collapse might strengthen communist parties. Britain, exhausted financially by the war, also wanted Germany to become economically functional. France remained deeply concerned about German power, but it too became part of the developing Western system. And so the occupation zones slowly began to move apart. The American and British zones were economically combined. The French zone later joined more closely with them. Western administrators promoted economic recovery. The Soviet occupation zone moved toward nationalization, centralized planning, and political domination by the Socialist Unity Party. Berlin reflected every one of these disagreements. The city was still officially governed by all four Allied powers. Yet East and West Berlin were beginning to live according to different rules. A person walking through the city could cross from one political world into another without encountering a wall. That was the strange thing. The division was becoming deeper, even while the streets remained open. Someone might buy a newspaper in the Soviet sector, walk several blocks west, and see headlines describing the same event in completely different language. A political speech praised as a defense of peace in one sector might be condemned as communist pressure in another. Economic problems were explained differently. The future of Germany was described differently. Even the past was being remembered differently. And by 1948, money itself became part of the conflict. Germany's existing currency had been badly damaged by wartime inflation, shortages, and a vast black market. The Reichsmark still officially existed, but in many everyday transactions, it had lost much of its practical meaning. People often preferred goods to money. Cigarettes could function as currency. Coffee had value. Soap had value. A pair of shoes could be worth more than a stack of banknotes. The Western occupying powers believed that serious economic recovery required a new currency. In June 1948, they introduced the Deutsche Mark in their occupation zones. The currency reform was intended to stabilize the economy and encourage normal commercial life. To the Western powers, it was an economic necessity. To the Soviet leadership, it was political evidence. A separate currency suggested a separate economy. A separate economy suggested a separate state. And a separate West German state, aligned with the United States and its allies, was exactly what Moscow did not want. The issue became especially explosive in Berlin. The Western powers introduced the new currency into their sectors of the city. The Soviet authorities responded with their own currency measures. Then, on June 24, 1948, the Soviet Union cut the surface access routes linking the western sectors of Berlin to Western Germany. Railways were blocked. Road traffic was stopped. Canals were closed. Electricity supplied from the Soviet-controlled area was severely restricted. West Berlin was suddenly isolated. Look at a map, and the danger becomes easy to understand. The western sectors of Berlin were not located beside West Germany. They were surrounded. To travel from West Berlin to the Western occupation zones, a person had to cross more than 100 miles of Soviet-controlled territory. Now those routes were closed. The Soviet leadership calculated that the Western powers faced a difficult choice. They could abandon West Berlin. They could attempt to force their way through by land, risking military confrontation. Or they could try something that seemed almost absurd in scale. Supply an entire city by air. The Western powers chose the sky. The operation became known as the Berlin Airlift. It was one of the most remarkable logistical efforts of the early Cold War. American and British aircraft began flying supplies into the western sectors. At first, the quantities were limited, but the challenge was enormous. West Berlin needed food every day. It needed medicine. It needed industrial materials. Most of all, especially as colder weather approached, it needed coal. Coal-heated homes. Coal-powered industry. Coal helped generate electricity. And coal was heavy. An aircraft carrying sacks of flour was useful. An aircraft carrying tons of coal was essential. Soon, the air corridors into Berlin became crowded with a constant procession of transport planes. They arrived in carefully timed intervals. One aircraft landed. Another approached. Another followed behind it. Crews unloaded cargo as quickly as possible. Then the aircraft departed and made room for the next. The rhythm continued day and night, in clear weather, in fog, in rain, in winter cold. For Berliners, the sound became part of ordinary existence. An aircraft overhead might once have meant danger. Now it meant breakfast, heat, electricity, a few more days of endurance. At Tempelhof Airport in the American sector, planes descended over apartment buildings at startlingly low altitude. Residents could look upward and see the underside of aircraft passing close above the rooftops. Children became especially fascinated. Some gathered near the approaches to the airport to watch the planes. One American pilot, Gail Halverson, noticed children standing near the fence. He spoke with them and later began dropping small packages of candy attached to improvised parachutes made from handkerchiefs. Before making a drop, he would wiggle the wings of his aircraft so the children would know which plane was his. The gesture grew into a larger effort. The pilots associated with these candy drops became affectionately remembered by many as candy bombers. It was a small human story inside an enormous geopolitical crisis. And perhaps that was why it endured. Only a few years earlier, American aircraft had bombed German cities. Now, American pilots were dropping chocolate for German children. History had turned with remarkable speed. But beneath the memorable stories, the airlift remained exhausting and dangerous work. Pilots flew demanding schedules. Weather conditions could become treacherous. Aircraft sometimes crashed. Crews died. Ground workers labored through long shifts unloading cargo. Berliners helped maintain airfields and move supplies. At Tempelhof, Gatow, and later Tegel, the machinery of survival operated almost continuously. Tegel Airport itself was constructed with astonishing speed in the French sector to increase the capacity of the airlift. Thousands of Berliners participated in preparing the site. An obstacle stood nearby, a Soviet-controlled radio mast. The mast interfered with flight paths. French authorities eventually removed it. The episode was almost symbolic. Even technical objects in Berlin had begun acquiring geopolitical meaning. As the months passed, the airlift became more efficient. Aircraft grew larger. Schedules became tighter. Ground operations became faster. Cargo volumes increased dramatically. The Western powers discovered that what had first seemed barely possible could, with enormous organization, actually be sustained. The blockade had been intended to make West Berlin vulnerable. Instead, it helped transform the city into one of the strongest symbols of Western commitment. For ordinary people, however, symbolism could not make winter warm. The winter of 1948 and 1949 was difficult. Electricity was often available only for limited periods. Homes could be cold. Food remained rationed. People became accustomed to conserving everything. Lights were turned off whenever possible. Fuel was carefully measured. Factories reduced operations. Families planned daily routines around power schedules. There was no guarantee that the airlift would continue indefinitely. And there was always the larger fear. What if the Soviet Union tried to stop the planes? What if an aircraft was fired upon? What if the Western powers attempted to reopen the roads with armed convoys? What if one misunderstanding became a battle? And what if that battle became another European war? Only 3 years had passed since the end of the Second World War. The ruins of that war were still visible outside Berlin windows. No one needed much imagination to understand what a new war could mean. This gave the Berlin crisis its peculiar tension. It was dramatic without becoming violent on the scale many feared. The Soviet Union blocked the land routes but did not shoot down the supply aircraft. The Western powers flew through agreed air corridors but did not attempt to smash the blockade with tanks. Both sides applied pressure. Both sides demonstrated resolve. And both sides remained aware that there was a line they should not casually cross. This pattern would become familiar during the Cold War. Confrontation without direct war. Threats without final escalation. Military power displayed but carefully restrained. Berlin was becoming one of the places where the two sides learned how dangerous the new world could be. The crisis also changed the political identity of West Berlin. Before the blockade, many Berliners had complicated feelings about the occupation. Foreign troops were, after all, foreign troops. Germany had been defeated. The Western Allies were occupiers. But the blockade altered perceptions. The American, British, and French presence increasingly came to be seen by many West Berliners as protection rather than simply occupation. The aircraft did more than deliver supplies. They created a political bond. The city's resistance to Soviet pressure was personified by figures such as Ernst Reuter, the mayor of West Berlin. In September 1948, Reuter spoke before a huge crowd near the ruined Reichstag. He appealed to the people of the world not to abandon Berlin. His message was emotional and direct. West Berlin, he argued, was demonstrating that it would not surrender its political future under pressure. Large crowds mattered in the struggle over Berlin because every action had an audience. The Soviet Union watched. The United States watched. European governments watched. Germans in both Eastern and Western zones watched. Berlin was no longer merely a damaged capital awaiting a political settlement. It had become a stage. Every aircraft landing at Tempelhof communicated something. Every mass rally communicated something. Every blocked train communicated something. And every day, West Berlin remained supplied, weakened the original purpose of the blockade. By the spring of 1949, it had become clear that the Western powers were not leaving. The blockade had failed to force them out. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union ended the blockade. Surface traffic resumed. Trains moved again. Roads reopened. Barges could once more travel toward the western sectors. The airlift continued for several additional months to build reserves and ensure that access would remain reliable. Then, gradually, the extraordinary procession of aircraft diminished. For nearly a year, West Berlin had survived through the air. The crisis ended without a battle. But almost everything had changed. The mistrust between former wartime allies had deepened. Germany was moving rapidly toward permanent political division, and Berlin had become one of the central symbols of the new conflict. Only days after the blockade ended, the Western occupation zones formally became the Federal Republic of Germany. It was commonly called West Germany. A new government was established. A new political system began to take shape. Several months later, in October 1949, the Soviet occupation zone became the German Democratic Republic. It was commonly called East Germany. Now the division had names: two German states, two governments, two economic systems, two political orders. The Federal Republic of Germany developed as a parliamentary democracy closely connected to the Western powers. The German Democratic Republic described itself as an anti-fascist socialist state and became part of the Soviet political and economic sphere. Berlin remained more complicated. West Berlin was closely associated with the Federal Republic of Germany, but retained a special legal status under the Western occupying powers. East Berlin increasingly functioned as the capital of East Germany, although the Western powers did not accept all of the claims surrounding that status. The legal details were complicated. Daily life was simpler. If you lived in Berlin, you now inhabited a city divided between two emerging worlds. And yet the border was still open enough to cross. That fact would become one of the greatest problems facing the East German government. During the early 1950s, the difference between the two German states grew wider. West Germany began experiencing rapid economic recovery. Factories expanded production. Employment increased. Consumer goods became more available. The transformation would later be described as an economic miracle. Much of Western Europe was recovering as well, supported in part by American assistance and growing trade. West Berlin participated in this Western economic world, although its isolated geographical position made it unusual and expensive to sustain. The city received substantial financial support. Its survival remained politically important to the Western powers. East Germany followed another path. Large industries were placed under state ownership. Agriculture would increasingly be reorganized. Production targets were established through centralized planning. Political opposition was restricted. The Socialist Unity Party became dominant throughout state institutions. The government claimed to be building a society that had broken decisively with fascism and capitalism. Supporters believed socialism promised greater equality and protection from the forces that had helped produce the disasters of the first half of the century. But the new order also demanded obedience. Political pluralism narrowed. Independent institutions weakened. Criticism could carry consequences. And a new security apparatus began watching the population. In February 1950, East Germany established the Ministry for State Security. It would become known around the world as the Stasi. At first, it was smaller than the enormous institution it would later become. But the principle was already present. The state would protect itself not only at borders, but inside society. Information would become a form of control. Files would become a form of power. Suspicion would become an administrative practice. The deeper the political systems diverged, the stranger Berlin became. The border between East and West Germany outside Berlin was increasingly controlled. Crossing from one German state to the other became more difficult. But inside Berlin, movement remained comparatively easy. A person from East Germany could travel to East Berlin. From there, the person might cross into West Berlin. And once inside West Berlin, routes existed toward West Germany. This made Berlin a hole in the developing Iron Curtain. A narrow opening. But a very important one. The consequences soon became visible. East Germans began leaving. Some departed for political reasons. Some feared the growing control of the Socialist Unity Party. Some wanted better economic opportunities. Some were worried about their children's futures. Some were professionals who believed they could earn more in the West. Some simply wanted greater personal freedom. The East German authorities called many of them refugees from the Republic and treated their departure as a political betrayal. But the numbers kept growing. For the government, this was not merely embarrassing. It was dangerous. A country could lose workers and replace them. It could lose young people and train others. But if too many doctors, engineers, teachers, technicians, scientists, and skilled workers left, the economic consequences could become severe. And the political meaning was even worse. The East German government presented socialism as a better future. Yet thousands of its citizens were choosing to leave for the other system. Every person departing through Berlin became a silent argument. And Berlin made that argument visible. You could stand in East Berlin and see West Berlin. You could hear Western radio. You could sometimes watch Western television. You could cross a street or board a train and encounter another political reality. Few borders in history have been so psychologically difficult for a government to manage. The competing system was not thousands of miles away. It was at the next railway station. It was across the avenue. It was glowing in shop windows. It was playing music on the radio after dark. During these years, tension also rose inside East Germany. In 1953, the government increased work demands for many industrial workers. The measure came at a time of economic strain and public dissatisfaction. On June 16th, construction workers in East Berlin began protesting. The demonstrations expanded rapidly. By the next day, protests and strikes had spread to many parts of East Germany. Workers demanded not only changes to production quotas, but, in some places, broader political reforms. For the East German leadership, the unrest became a serious threat. Soviet forces intervened. Tanks appeared in the streets. The uprising was suppressed. People were killed. Thousands were arrested. The events of June 1953 left a deep mark. For the East German government, they demonstrated how fragile political control could become. For many citizens, they demonstrated the limits of open protest under Soviet power. And for the Western world, the images of Soviet tanks confronting East German workers strengthened the idea that Eastern European governments survived, partly because Moscow was willing to defend them. Berlin had now witnessed another confrontation. First blockade, then airlift, then uprising, then tanks. Yet still there was no wall. People continued moving across the city. That freedom of movement was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile with the political system East Germany was trying to create. The leadership could control newspapers. It could control schools. It could control many workplaces. It could arrest opponents. It could monitor political organizations. But as long as Berlin remained open, there was one thing it could not fully control: departure. And departure became a growing crisis. By the second half of the 1950s, the flow of people leaving East Germany was increasingly alarming. Many were young. Many were educated. Many were exactly the people an industrialized socialist state needed most. The government could build new factories, establish new universities, and announce ambitious economic plans. But it could not easily replace an experienced surgeon who packed a suitcase and left. It could not quickly replace an engineer, or a chemist, or a skilled machinist, or thousands of ambitious young people who looked west and saw possibilities unavailable at home. Berlin increasingly became the route through which those choices were made. A person could arrive at an East Berlin railway station carrying very little. Perhaps one suitcase. Perhaps a coat. Perhaps documents hidden beneath clothing. Perhaps nothing that suggested permanent departure. Then that person could cross into the western sectors. Some told relatives they would be gone only a few days. Some said nothing at all. The reason for silence was simple. A goodbye could be dangerous. A farewell could attract attention. And sometimes it was easier to leave if the people you loved did not fully understand what you were planning. This created a peculiar sadness in East German homes. An empty chair could represent more than absence. It could represent uncertainty. Had someone really left forever? Would they write? Would authorities intercept the letter? Would the family be punished? Would they ever see one another again? For years, there was still a possibility. One could cross Berlin. One could visit. One could sometimes maintain a life stretched between two political systems. But every year, that arrangement looked less sustainable. The Soviet Union and the Western powers continued arguing over Berlin's future. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev repeatedly challenged the Western presence in the city. He wanted the occupation arrangements changed and hoped to reduce what Moscow regarded as a dangerous Western outpost inside East Germany. The United States refused to abandon West Berlin. Its credibility was now tied to remaining. The city had become more than territory. It had become a promise. If the United States withdrew from West Berlin under pressure, allies elsewhere might wonder whether American commitments to them could also disappear. So both sides remained. The Soviet Union could not easily remove the Western powers without risking war. The Western powers could not unite the city without challenging Soviet control of East Germany. And the East German government faced a population problem that grew worse every month. This was the strange balance of Berlin at the end of the 1950s. Everyone understood that the existing situation was unstable. Almost no one knew how it would end. The city remained open. Trains still crossed sectors. Families still visited. Workers still commuted. Students still moved between worlds. Young people still stood in West Berlin shop windows and looked at things unavailable in the East. East Berliners could still cross the boundary and discover how close another life seemed. That openness gave Berlin energy. It also made the city dangerous to the East German state. A border existed, but it did not yet function like a border. And as more people discovered that they could use Berlin as an exit, the East German leadership began facing a question that became harder to avoid. How do you keep an entire population inside a country when one door remains open? For a few more years, that door would remain open. People would step through it every day. Some would return home that evening. Some would never return at all. The city would continue pretending that its division could remain incomplete. But by the summer of 1961, the numbers leaving East Germany would become impossible for its government to ignore. Rumors would begin circulating. Families would start asking whether the border might suddenly close. Journalists would ask East German leaders directly whether they intended to build a wall. And the answer would seem reassuring. For a little while. Because the greatest division in Berlin was still invisible. There were political boundaries. There were police. There were checkpoints. There were competing governments. But there was still space between them. Space through which a human being could walk. And that space was about to disappear. In the summer of 1961, Berlin still had doors. That was what made the city so unusual. Germany had already been divided into two states for more than a decade. The political systems on either side had grown farther apart with every passing year. The border between East Germany and West Germany had become increasingly difficult to cross. But Berlin remained different. Here, the division was real, yet incomplete. A person could still wake in East Berlin, take a train across the city, spend the day in West Berlin, and return home in the evening. Someone could live under one political system and work under another. A family could have parents on one side and children on the other. A student could attend lectures in the West and sleep in an apartment in the East. A nurse could cross the sector boundary before breakfast, work an entire shift in a Western hospital, and come home after dark. The city was divided, but it was still connected by thousands of ordinary journeys. Every morning, railway stations filled with people carrying lunch bags, newspapers, handbags, briefcases, and work clothes. Most were not escaping. They were commuting. They were visiting. They were shopping. They were meeting friends. They were living inside a city whose politics had been split apart more completely than its streets. That condition could not last forever. The East German leadership understood this more clearly with every passing month. Because Berlin was not simply a place where East and West existed beside one another. It was a place where they could be compared. And comparison was dangerous. A resident of East Berlin did not need a political pamphlet to discover that life in the West looked different. The evidence was visible in shop windows. It was heard on the radio. It appeared in advertisements. It could be tasted in a cafe, worn as a coat, or seen in the crowded shelves of a department store. West Germany had experienced a remarkable period of economic growth during the 1950s. Factories produced automobiles, appliances, radios, clothing, and consumer goods in quantities that would have seemed almost unimaginable in the ruins of 1945. Wages rose. Employment expanded. New housing appeared. Families bought refrigerators. Television sets entered more homes. Motor scooters and small cars filled streets that had once been covered with rubble. West Berlin shared in this prosperity, although its isolated location made it economically dependent on assistance from the West German government and the Western powers. The city was subsidized because its survival mattered politically, and that support helped create a remarkable contrast. In some districts, West Berlin had bright storefronts, advertising signs, cinemas, cafes, and a growing culture of consumption. Across the sector boundary, East Berlin was also rebuilding. There were new apartment blocks. Factories returned to production. Schools reopened. Cultural institutions were restored. The East German government invested heavily in presenting East Berlin as the capital of a new socialist Germany. Large boulevards and monumental architecture were intended to represent confidence, order, and a break with the capitalist past. But shortages remained common. Consumer choice was more limited. Housing problems continued. Some goods were difficult to obtain, and wages often did not compare favorably with those available in West Berlin. That difference created one of the strangest labor patterns in Europe. Thousands of people lived in East Berlin or the surrounding areas but worked in West Berlin. They became known as border commuters. Each day, they crossed into the western sectors for employment, where wages could be more attractive. Then they returned to homes in the east. To the East German government, these commuters were a growing political and economic problem. They earned Western currency. They spent time inside a competing system. They encountered Western newspapers, television, advertising, and conversation. Then they returned home, carrying not only money or goods, but impressions. A pair of shoes could become political. A new radio could become political. A package of coffee could become political. The simple statement that something was easier to buy in the West could become political. The competition between East and West Germany was not fought only through speeches or military alliances. It entered kitchens. It entered wardrobes. It entered conversations between relatives. And because Berlin remained open, the comparison could be made every day. For some people, that comparison eventually became a decision. Leave. Between the creation of East Germany in 1949 and the summer of 1961, millions of people left the country for the West. A very large number of them passed through Berlin. The scale of this movement terrified the East German leadership. It was not only the number of people, it was who many of them were. Young adults, doctors, engineers, teachers, scientists, technicians, skilled workers, students. People in the years when they were expected to build careers, raise families, and contribute to the economy. The East German state had educated many of them. Then they left. Imagine a hospital administrator arriving at work and learning that another physician had gone west. Imagine a factory losing an experienced engineer. Imagine a school beginning a new term without a teacher who had quietly departed during the summer. Each individual departure could be explained. Taken together, they became a crisis. The government described those who left as people abandoning the republic. Official propaganda sometimes portrayed them as selfish, disloyal, corrupted by Western promises, or manipulated by enemies. But the reasons people left were often far more ordinary. A young engineer might believe his career would develop faster in West Germany. A family might want to join relatives who had already left. A student might fear political restrictions at university. A shopkeeper might resent state economic policies. A farmer might oppose collectivization. Someone with a politically suspect family background might believe that certain professions would remain closed forever. Others wanted to speak more openly, to travel, to read what they wanted, to build a future without asking permission from the state. And some people were not deeply political at all. They simply looked west and believed life might be easier there. Departure rarely began with a dramatic speech. It began with private calculations. How much could fit into a suitcase without attracting attention? Which papers should be taken? What should be left behind so that neighbors would think the family intended to return? Would furniture make the apartment look occupied for another few days? Should relatives be told? Should children be told? Would a child reveal the plan at school? If someone asked why the family was carrying luggage, what explanation would sound believable? These were not abstract political questions. They were questions asked quietly at kitchen tables. Sometimes after the curtains had been closed. Sometimes with the radio turned on to cover the sound of conversation. Sometimes after children had gone to bed. There was a painful contradiction in the openness of Berlin. The border made escape possible. But that very possibility made every decision more uncertain. Someone who lived near a permanently sealed frontier might believe departure was impossible. In Berlin, departure could seem almost too easy. A train ride, a station platform, a walk across the street, a suitcase carried without looking nervous. Then suddenly, another world. Some people left impulsively. Others planned for months. Some traveled first to West Berlin alone, found housing or employment, then tried to bring relatives later. Some couples disagreed. One wanted to go. The other wanted to stay. Parents worried about elderly relatives. Young people feared losing opportunities if they remained. Older people feared losing everything familiar if they left. A city of millions became filled with these small, invisible negotiations. And the East German government could feel the consequences. By 1960 and 1961, the flow intensified. The economic pressure was serious. But the political humiliation may have been even worse. East Germany claimed to represent the future. Its leaders described socialism as a more just, more rational, more peaceful social order. Yet its citizens could walk into West Berlin and choose not to come back. The existence of that choice weakened the state's claims every day. Berlin had become a kind of voting booth with no ballot. People voted with their feet. And the results were increasingly difficult to hide. Walter Ulbricht, now the dominant political figure in East Germany, faced enormous pressure. He had spent years building the institutions of the East German state. Industry had been reorganized. Agriculture was being collectivized. Political opposition had been suppressed. The security services had expanded. Education and culture were increasingly shaped by socialist ideology. But none of those measures solved the problem of Berlin. The border remained open. Ulbricht wanted greater control. He also needed Soviet support. East Germany was not free to make a decision of this magnitude alone. Anything that happened in Berlin risked involving the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. That was why every move had to be considered through the larger danger of the Cold War. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, had repeatedly pressured the Western powers over Berlin. He wanted the special occupation status of the city changed. He threatened at different moments to transfer control of access routes to East Germany. He hoped to weaken the Western position without causing a direct military conflict. But the Western powers refused to leave. For the United States, West Berlin had become a symbol too important to surrender. President John Kennedy entered office in January 1961 and soon inherited the Berlin crisis. He was young. He was relatively inexperienced in foreign affairs. And he faced a Soviet leader who intended to test him. Kennedy and Khrushchev met in Vienna in June 1961. The meeting was tense. Berlin dominated much of the discussion. Khrushchev again pressed his demands. Kennedy refused to abandon Western rights in the city. Neither man wanted war, but both needed to appear firm. The danger lay in the fact that firmness on both sides could become escalation. By then, nuclear weapons had transformed international politics. A crisis in Berlin could no longer be imagined as a local European problem. American and Soviet forces stood within a divided Germany. Both superpowers possessed nuclear arsenals. A confrontation over a checkpoint could, at least in theory, lead somewhere unimaginably larger. And still, every morning, ordinary Berliners went to work. That contrast is one of the strangest features of the summer of 1961. At the highest level, leaders discussed war, alliances, ultimatums, and nuclear deterrence. At street level, someone bought bread. Someone met a friend for coffee. Someone took a child to school. Someone crossed from East Berlin into West Berlin carrying a small suitcase and never came home. The crisis was enormous, and it was ordinary. The number of people leaving East Germany continued rising through the summer. Railway stations became places of suspicion. Authorities watched travelers more closely. People feared that obvious luggage might attract attention. Some sent belongings ahead. Others abandoned almost everything. For those who escaped, West Berlin was often not the final destination. Refugee reception centers processed arrivals before many were flown onward to West Germany. One of the best known was the Marienfelde Refugee Center in West Berlin. People arrived there exhausted, uncertain, and often carrying little. They were interviewed, registered, given temporary accommodation. Then many were transported into West Germany to begin new lives. To Western observers, these refugees were powerful evidence of the failure of East German socialism. To East German officials, they represented a hemorrhage. The government tried persuasion. It tried propaganda. It tried administrative pressure. It tried restrictions. Nothing stopped the flow. By July 1961, tens of thousands were leaving in a single month. In early August, the numbers accelerated further. Rumors spread through Berlin. Something was going to happen. No one knew exactly what. Would the Soviet Union sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany? Would Western access routes be disrupted? Would the sector boundary inside Berlin be tightened? Would train stations be closed? Would military forces move? Would there be a wall? The idea of physically sealing the city sounded extreme. Berlin was too interconnected. Rail lines crossed sectors. Streets crossed sectors. Water pipes and telephone systems crossed sectors. Some apartment buildings stood directly beside the boundary. In certain places, walking from east to west required no more than crossing a road. How could anyone seal all of that? And yet the logic was becoming unavoidable. If the East German government could not persuade people to stay, it could prevent them from leaving. On June 15, 1961, Walter Ulbricht appeared at an international press conference in East Berlin. A journalist asked him about the possibility of creating a state border at the Brandenburg Gate. Ulbricht responded with a sentence that would later become famous. He said that no one had the intention of building a wall. At that moment, no concrete wall was being erected. But plans to close the border were moving toward reality. The statement became haunting because of what happened less than 2 months later. Berliners heard the denial. Some believed it. Some did not. Some understood that governments sometimes deny precisely the action they are preparing to take. And so the city entered the final weeks before the closure in a state of uneasy uncertainty. For families already considering departure, the rumors changed everything. Waiting became dangerous. A decision that had once seemed possible next month might become impossible tomorrow. People began leaving faster. A student who intended to finish another semester might decide not to risk it. A doctor considering a job offer in the West might suddenly leave without notice. A family might abandon plans to save money and simply go. Every new departure increased the pressure on the government, and every increase in pressure made border closure more likely. The crisis began feeding itself. In apartments across East Berlin, conversations became shorter and more urgent. Should we leave tonight? What about your mother? Can she come later? What if the border closes? What if this is only a rumor? What if we leave and regret it? What if we stay and cannot leave at all? There were no easy answers. Some people chose to stay because East Germany was home. Their family was there. Their work was there. Their memories were there. They may have disliked the government without wanting to abandon their country. Others believed socialism could still improve. Some feared the uncertainty of starting again in the West. Some thought the crisis would pass. Some simply could not imagine that a modern European city might soon be cut apart with barbed wire. That disbelief was understandable. Berlin had been divided politically for 16 years. But trains still ran. People still crossed. Whatever the governments argued about, the city itself seemed to resist complete separation. A street remained a street. A railway tunnel remained a railway tunnel. A doorway remained a doorway. Until suddenly it did not. By early August, East German and Soviet officials had reached the decision. The sector boundary would be closed. The operation had to be carried out quickly. Surprise was essential. If the population knew the exact date, another massive wave of departures could begin. If the Western powers received warning, diplomatic or military complications might follow. So preparations were conducted in secrecy. Orders were distributed carefully. Police units were readied. East German soldiers and members of paramilitary organizations were assigned positions. Barbed wire was stockpiled. Vehicles were prepared. Transport routes were studied. The city continued its ordinary routines while plans were being made to cut those routines apart. This is perhaps the most unsettling image of all. On Friday, August 11th, people went to work. On Saturday, August 12th, families went shopping. Children played. Couples met. Streetcars moved along familiar routes. People crossed the sector boundary to visit relatives. Some attended theaters or cafes. Some listened to the radio. Some discussed the rumors again. Many expected trouble eventually. Few knew that eventually meant that night. As evening came, Berlin settled into a warm summer weekend. Lights appeared in apartment windows. Restaurants began closing. Late trains carried passengers home. People prepared for Sunday. Some East Berliners crossed back from the West because they expected to return again the next day. That small decision would remain in memory for the rest of their lives. Had they known what was coming, they might have stayed. But history rarely announces the final ordinary evening before everything changes. Around midnight, East German security forces began moving. Trucks rolled through dark streets. Soldiers arrived at intersections. Police occupied railway stations. Workers carried coils of barbed wire. Road surfaces were opened. Barricades were placed across streets. Rail connections were interrupted. The boundary between East and West Berlin, a line that had existed mostly on maps and in administrative rules, began to take physical form. Most of the city was asleep. In some apartments, people heard vehicles outside and turned toward the window. Perhaps they saw soldiers. Perhaps they saw lights. Perhaps they assumed it was an exercise. Then the wire began to unroll. Street by street. Crossing by crossing. Station by station. The open border that had shaped Berlin for 16 years was disappearing in the darkness. By morning, families would discover that the distance between them had changed. A relative living a few blocks away might suddenly be unreachable. A workplace could be on the wrong side. A railway platform could lead nowhere. A familiar street could end at barbed wire. There had been no public vote. No warning. No farewell. Only a night of quiet movement. And when Berlin woke on Sunday, August 13, 1961, the city would no longer be divided only by politics. The division would be visible. It would be guarded. it would be enforced. And for millions of people, one of the most important words in everyday life would suddenly become a word that had barely existed the day before. The border. Just after midnight on August 13th, 1961, Berlin began to close. There was no announcement to the sleeping population. No siren warned families that the streets they had crossed for years were about to become borders. No public ceremony marked the beginning. Instead, trucks moved through the darkness. Police units took their positions. Soldiers stepped into intersections. Workers unloaded posts, barriers, and coils of barbed wire. The city was still quiet enough that the sound of engines carried between apartment buildings. Streetlights reflected against windows. A few late travelers stopped and stared. Most people were asleep. And while they slept, one of the most important borders of the 20th century was being created around them. The first barrier was not the massive concrete wall remembered today. It was much simpler. Barbed wire, wooden barricades, roadblocks, armed guards. The purpose was immediate. Stop movement. Prevent East Germans from entering West Berlin. Seal the routes before the city fully understood what was happening. East German authorities called the operation a defensive measure. Later, they would describe the barrier as an anti-fascist protective wall, a structure supposedly designed to defend East Germany from hostile Western influence. But the direction of the guards told a different story. The wall was not primarily built to prevent Westerners from entering. It was built to prevent Easterners from leaving. By the early morning, hundreds of crossing points had been blocked. Streets that had run uninterrupted for generations suddenly ended in wire. Rail connections were cut. Subway and urban railway services were disrupted or rerouted. Some stations in East Berlin were closed to Western passengers. Others would later become strange underground spaces through which trains passed without stopping. These would become known as ghost stations. Imagine riding a subway train through the darkness beneath the divided city. The train slows. A platform appears. Dim lights reveal signs, tiled walls, and perhaps armed guards. But no passengers enter. No passengers leave. Then the train continues into the tunnel. Above ground, the division was even more visible. At dawn, Berliners began appearing at windows and street corners. They saw soldiers. They saw police. They saw a wire stretched across familiar roads. They saw men drilling holes into pavement and setting posts into place. Some stood silently. Others shouted. Some demanded explanations. Many simply tried to understand what they were looking at. A woman might have visited her sister in West Berlin every Sunday. Now soldiers told her she could not pass. A man who worked in the West might wake to discover that his workplace had suddenly become inaccessible. Grandparents found themselves separated from grandchildren. Friends who had lived a short walk apart now stood in different political systems. The geographical distance had not changed. The human distance had become enormous. In several places, people approached the barrier and called across it. Names moved through the morning air. Questions were shouted. Can you hear me? Are you all right? What is happening? When will they open it again? No one knew. The first hours contained a kind of confusion that would soon disappear. The barrier looked temporary. Barbed wire can be removed. Wooden barricades can be moved. Soldiers can receive different orders. Some Berliners assumed the crisis might last a few days, perhaps a week. Perhaps there would be negotiations. Perhaps the roads would reopen. It was difficult to imagine that the division could become permanent. But East German forces were already beginning the next stage. The temporary barriers would be reinforced. Wire would become masonry. Masonry would become concrete. Windows would be sealed. Buildings would be demolished. Open spaces would be cleared. And the border would slowly become a system rather than a simple wall. In the first days, however, there were still weaknesses. And some people tried to use them. At locations where apartment buildings stood directly along the sector boundary, the geography became extraordinary. A building might physically stand in East Berlin while the sidewalk beneath its front windows belonged to the western sector. That meant a person inside an East Berlin apartment could open a window and look down into West Berlin. For a brief time, the window itself became a border crossing. People began jumping. Some lowered belongings first. Some climbed from windows onto ladders raised by West Berlin firefighters. Some descended using ropes. Others simply leaped. The lower floors were the easiest. Then, East German authorities began sealing entrances and windows. Residents were removed from border buildings. Doors were bricked up. Windows were blocked. In some cases, buildings themselves were later demolished to create a clearer line of control. The border was learning. Every escape revealed a weakness. Every weakness produced a new layer of security. One of the most famous images from the early days of the division captured a young East German border guard named Konrad Schumann. On August 15th, only 2 days after the border closure, Schumann stood near a low barrier of barbed wire. He was 19 years old. On the western side, photographers and bystanders watched. For a few moments, he appeared uncertain. Then he ran. In one motion, he jumped over the wire, dropped his weapon, and entered West Berlin. The photograph of his leap became an enduring symbol of the Cold War. A young soldier, still in uniform, suspended in midair above a border he had been assigned to guard. The image was dramatic, but its meaning was also deeply uncomfortable for East German authorities. If even the people guarding the border wanted to escape, what did that say about the border itself? The answer was more fortification. The government needed guards who would obey. It needed physical obstacles that could not be crossed with a single jump. It needed a border designed not merely to discourage movement, but to make escape extremely difficult. For the people living beside it, the transformation happened quickly. Streets became dead ends. Public transportation patterns changed. Neighborhoods that had once flowed naturally into one another became separated. A bakery that had served customers from both sides lost half its neighborhood. A church congregation might suddenly find members unable to attend. A cemetery could end beside a guarded boundary. A garden might sit only a few meters from another garden that had become unreachable. Berlin had always been a collection of neighborhoods. Now many of those neighborhoods had been cut open. The most painful scenes often involved people who could see one another but could not meet. Families gathered on opposite sides of barriers. They waved. They shouted messages. They held up children so elderly relatives could see how much they had grown. Sometimes they used binoculars. Sometimes they stood for long periods saying almost nothing because there was only so much that could be communicated across wire and distance. The cruelty was not simply that people were far apart. It was that they were close. Close enough to recognize a face. Too far to touch it. Political leaders watched the crisis carefully. West Berlin was furious. Mayor Willy Brandt condemned the closure and demanded a stronger response from the Western Allies. Many West Berliners feared that the barrier was only the beginning. If the East German government could seal the internal border, would Soviet pressure next force the Western powers out of West Berlin entirely? Would the United States defend the city? Would Britain and France remain? Would tanks move? Would the crisis become war? President John Kennedy faced a difficult calculation. The United States opposed the wall. It condemned the human consequences. But the Western powers had never guaranteed unrestricted movement between East and West Berlin for East German citizens. Their central commitment was different. They were committed to maintaining their own access to West Berlin and protecting the Western sectors. The wall was terrible for the people trapped behind it. But it did not remove the Western powers from Berlin. And in a grim way, it reduced one of the pressures creating instability. East Germany had been losing citizens at an unsustainable rate. Closing the border stopped that flow. The Soviet Union could preserve its East German ally without attempting to force the West out of the city. The crisis became more stable precisely because the city became less free. This was one of the darkest paradoxes of the Berlin Wall. It was a human catastrophe. But strategically, it helped freeze the conflict. It turned a fluid crisis into a physical boundary. It said, in concrete and wire, this is where one system ends and the other begins. Kennedy later expressed the logic in private terms that were brutally realistic. A wall, however ugly, was better than a war. That did not mean the wall was acceptable. It meant the alternatives were frightening. In 1961, the United States and Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons. Military forces from both blocs faced one another across Europe. Any attempt by Western troops to tear down the barrier could have brought them into direct conflict with East German or Soviet forces. No Western leader wanted to risk a global war over freedom of movement inside Berlin. So the wall remained. And the people most affected by it had to absorb the consequences. Still, the danger of military confrontation did not disappear. In October 1961, only a few months after the border closed, another crisis erupted at Checkpoint Charlie. Checkpoint Charlie was one of the crossing points between East and West Berlin. It became famous partly because American and Soviet military power came face to face there in a frighteningly direct way. The dispute began over the right of Western Allied personnel to enter East Berlin without submitting to East German border controls in a way that might imply recognition of East German authority over Allied rights. What began as a disagreement over documents became a confrontation. American tanks moved toward the checkpoint. Soviet tanks appeared on the other side. They stopped facing one another at close range. For hours, armored vehicles stood with guns ready in the center of Berlin. American soldiers looked east. Soviet soldiers looked west. Behind them stood a city filled with civilians who understood exactly what those tanks represented. The Second World War had ended only 16 years earlier. Now, two nuclear superpowers were confronting one another on a Berlin street. There was no battle. Both sides eventually withdrew their tanks gradually. One moved back, then another. The crisis eased. But the message was clear. Berlin remained dangerous. A dispute over a border crossing could move the world frighteningly close to armed confrontation. Meanwhile, the border itself continued evolving. The phrase Berlin Wall suggests a single continuous slab of concrete. In reality, the barrier became a complex system that changed over time. There were walls. There were fences. There were watchtowers. There were patrol roads. There were searchlights. There were alarm systems. There were areas cleared of obstacles so guards could see anyone attempting to cross. There were anti-vehicle barriers. There were dogs in some sections. There were carefully controlled crossing points. Between the outer and inner barriers developed a strip of open territory that became known in the West as the Death Strip. It was designed to expose anyone attempting escape. A person entering this space could be illuminated, tracked, chased, and, in some circumstances, shot. The system was not created in its final form overnight. It grew. Each year brought improvements from the perspective of the border authorities. Older barriers were replaced. Concrete sections became stronger. Observation improved. Escape routes were studied and blocked. The wall became an engineering project whose purpose was human containment. There was something chilling about its efficiency. A government had taken an emotional problem, the desire of citizens to leave, and transformed it into a technical problem. How high should a wall be? How wide should an open strip be? Where should lights be placed? How should guards patrol? Where were tunnels most likely? Which buildings should be demolished? Which streets should be closed permanently? Human longing was met with architecture. The city adjusted because cities always adjust. West Berliners learned new routes. East Berliners learned which streets ended at barriers. Children born after 1961 grew up accepting the wall as part of the landscape. For them, it was not a sudden wound remembered from before. It was simply there, a concrete fact of childhood, a place adults warned them about, a structure visible from trains, rooftops, and certain streets, a border that seemed as permanent as a river. But the adults remembered. They remembered when the street continued. They remembered when the railway stopped at every station. They remembered visiting relatives without special permission. They remembered an ordinary Berlin that had existed before the wire. That memory made the wall strange, even after people became used to seeing it. A structure can become familiar without becoming normal. This distinction mattered. East German propaganda presented the barrier as necessary protection. Western propaganda presented it as proof that the communist system had to imprison its own population to survive. Both sides used Berlin as a symbol. Western politicians visited. Journalists photographed the wall. Tourists came to look at it. Observation platforms allowed visitors in West Berlin to peer over sections of the barrier into the east. The wall became one of the most photographed objects in Europe. But for Berliners, it was not merely a symbol. It was practical. It determined where you could go, who you could visit, whether a family event could include everyone, whether a funeral could be attended, whether a child could know a grandparent, whether a friendship survived years of separation. Politics became geography. Geography became daily routine. And daily routine became memory. In the years after 1961, the East German government gradually developed controlled procedures for certain kinds of travel and visits, especially as political agreements evolved later in the Cold War. But the essential fact remained. Movement was no longer a right. It was permission. Permission could be granted. Permission could be denied. And for many people, especially young East Germans, leaving permanently remained nearly impossible through legal channels. So people began searching for other ways. If the streets were blocked, perhaps they could go underneath them. If the gates were guarded, perhaps they could hide inside vehicles. If the rivers were watched, perhaps there was still one place where a swimmer could pass unseen. If the wall grew higher, perhaps someone could build something that flew above it. The construction of the wall did not end the desire to escape. It changed its form. Before August 1961, escape could mean carrying a suitcase onto a train. After August 1961, it could mean months of planning. False papers, secret compartments, homemade equipment, dark tunnels, a few seconds beneath searchlights. The border had turned departure into an act of engineering, courage, deception, and sometimes desperation. Many would succeed. Many would fail. Some would be arrested. Some would spend years in prison. And some would die only a few meters from freedom. The wall had risen to stop movement. Now the struggle would become a contest between the people designing the border and the people trying to defeat it. Above ground, guards watched the concrete. Below ground, shovels would soon begin moving through Berlin's soil. The wall was designed to make escape impossible. That was its purpose. Every new layer of concrete, every watchtower, every floodlight, every patrol road, every fence, every guard post was part of the same calculation. If people could no longer simply walk into West Berlin, then perhaps they would stop trying. But they did not. Instead, the methods changed. The first escapes had been simple because the first barrier was simple. A jump over barbed wire. A dash across an open street. A leap from a window. A sudden decision made in seconds. As the border became stronger, escape became slower. More secretive. More technical. More dangerous. People studied maps. They measured distances. They watched guards. They learned patrol schedules. They examined sewer systems, railway tunnels, rivers, rooftops, and abandoned buildings. Some hid inside cars. Some used forged documents. Some crawled beneath the ground. Some crossed through water. Some built machines that looked less like vehicles than inventions from a dream. And some, after months of preparation, stepped into the darkness knowing that a single mistake could end everything. The Berlin Wall eventually became one of the most heavily guarded urban borders in the world. The exact appearance of the barrier differed from place to place and changed over the years. In some areas, the outer wall facing West Berlin was only one part of a larger system. Behind it could be an open strip of ground, a patrol road, lighting, signal fences, watchtowers, additional barriers. The broad, cleared zone gave guards a better view of anyone attempting to cross. From the western side, tourists often saw the famous concrete wall covered with graffiti. But the dangerous part lay beyond it. For anyone approaching from the east, the challenge was not simply getting over one wall. It was surviving an entire sequence of obstacles. And the border guards were armed. Orders governing the use of weapons changed in wording and application over time, but the reality was unmistakable. People attempting unauthorized escape could be fired upon. This possibility transformed every escape attempt into a confrontation with mortality. Perhaps the best-known early death at the wall was that of Peter Fechter. He was 18 years old. In August 1962, just over a year after the border was closed, Fechter and a friend attempted to escape near Checkpoint Charlie. They reached the border area. His friend made it across. Fechter did not. He was shot by East German guards and fell near the wall. He remained there, wounded and crying for help. People on the western side could see him. So could East German guards. For a painfully long time, no one reached him. He eventually died. The image of a young man bleeding near the wall became one of the most disturbing symbols of Berlin's division. The tragedy was made worse by proximity. West Berlin was only a short distance away. People could hear him. They could see him. But the border had turned a few meters of ground into a political abyss. His death caused anger in West Berlin. Crowds protested. The wall no longer looked merely like a barrier. It looked like a machine that could kill. Yet even stories like Fechter's did not stop escape attempts. They sometimes made the desire to leave more urgent. To understand why, it helps to remember that most people attempting escape did not think of themselves as historical figures. They were not trying to become symbols. They were trying to reach someone. A husband, a wife, a parent, a child, a friend, or simply another version of their own future. One of the most remarkable forms of escape involved tunnels. Berlin's underground geology became part of the Cold War. On the western side, students, activists, relatives, and others began digging beneath the border. The work was exhausting. It was dangerous. And it required secrecy. A tunnel could begin in a basement, a workshop, or an abandoned building. Diggers had to remove soil without attracting attention. They needed timber or other materials to prevent collapse. They needed ventilation, lighting, tools, a way to keep water from flooding the passage. And above all, they needed to reach the correct place on the eastern side. Too shallow, and the tunnel might collapse. Too deep, and the work became far more difficult. A mistake in direction could bring the exit into a street, a guarded courtyard, or some other impossible location. The people digging often worked at night. Hours passed underground. The air became warm and stale. Clothing became covered in dust and mud. Hands blistered. Muscles ached. Every shovel of earth moved the tunnel forward only a little. And yet each small movement carried extraordinary meaning. Some tunnels failed. Some were discovered. Some were infiltrated by informants. Some collapsed. But others worked. One of the most famous became known as Tunnel 57. In 1964, a group of West Berlin students and helpers dug beneath the border from the west toward East Berlin. The tunnel was narrow and difficult. For several nights, people were guided through it from east to west. 57 people escaped. The name came from the number who reached freedom. During the operation, East German border guards discovered what was happening. A confrontation followed. An East German guard was killed in the confusion. Even successful escapes carried consequences far beyond the people who crossed. There could be arrests, investigations, retaliation, interrogations, new security measures. Every escape route taught the border authorities something. A successful tunnel led to greater attention underground. A hidden compartment in a vehicle led to more careful inspections. A forged document led to stricter identity checks. The border evolved because the escapees forced it to evolve. It became a continuous contest between imagination and control. Cars became another battlefield. Some drivers modified vehicles to hide passengers. Compartments were built behind seats, inside dashboards, under floors, within trunks. People were compressed into spaces never meant to carry a human body. They remained silent at checkpoints. They listened to guards walking nearby. They heard doors open, papers being examined, questions being asked. Sometimes a border guard looked into the vehicle and saw nothing unusual. Then the car rolled forward. A few meters later, someone hidden in darkness realized they had crossed. But these methods were dangerous. A hidden compartment could be discovered. A nervous driver could betray the plan. An unexpected inspection could end everything. Cars were searched more thoroughly as authorities learned what to look for. Mirrors were used to examine undersides. Compartments were measured. Drivers were questioned. The border became suspicious of ordinary objects. A suitcase could be evidence. A truck could be a hiding place. A family trip could be an escape plan. Water offered another possibility. Berlin is crossed by rivers, canals, and lakes. Where the border met water, some people tried to swim. At night, the dark surface could seem like a path. But water was deceptive. It was cold. Currents could be strong. Searchlights could suddenly illuminate the surface. Guards watched bridges and banks. A swimmer moving slowly through dark water might have only minutes before being seen. Some succeeded. Others drowned or were shot. Again, the distance could be heartbreakingly small. Freedom might be visible on the opposite bank. The possibility of seeing the destination made the danger more intense, not less. Some escape attempts were so unusual that they became legendary. In 1979, 2 East German families attempted to fly over the border in a homemade hot air balloon. The plan sounds almost impossible. That was part of its power. They had no official aviation program, no safe testing ground, no permission. They needed fabric, large quantities of it. They needed a burner capable of producing enough hot air. They needed to estimate weight, lift, wind direction, altitude, fuel. And they needed to do all of this without drawing the attention of the authorities. The families worked secretly. They purchased fabric from different places to avoid suspicion. They experimented. Their first attempt failed. That failure made the danger worse. Evidence left behind could lead investigators toward them. Yet instead of giving up, they tried again. On the night of September 16, 1979, they launched their balloon. The families rose into the darkness. Below them lay East Germany. Somewhere ahead was the border. They had limited control over direction. They could rise or descend, but the wind would largely decide where they went. For a time, they drifted through the night. Then the balloon descended. They landed in a field. At first, they did not know whether they had reached the west. Imagine that moment. after months of planning, after the fear of discovery, after rising into the night with children and relatives aboard, you touch the ground and still do not know whether you are free. Eventually, they encountered West German police. They had crossed successfully. The homemade balloon became one of the most famous escape stories of the Cold War because it captured something essential about the wall. The state possessed concrete, weapons, searchlights, files, guards, and towers. The escapees possessed fabric, calculations, patience, and desperation. Sometimes that was enough. There were other extraordinary methods. People used homemade zip lines. Some tried to cross in specially altered vehicles. Others used light aircraft. Some escaped through sewers in the early years before those routes were better secured. A few exploited buildings and structures that crossed or approached the border in unusual ways. The details changed. The impulse did not. Every method began with the same thought. There must be another way. But every story of escape should be balanced against the stories of those who never made it. Thousands were arrested for attempting to flee East Germany. Some received prison sentences. Families could suffer consequences. Careers could be damaged. Children might grow up with the political record of their parents hanging over them. The East German state did not treat unauthorized departure as a private preference. It was a challenge to authority. To leave without permission was to reject the state's claim over movement. And so movement became political. Even the desire to move could become dangerous. Someone discussing escape with the wrong person might be reported. A friend might be an informant. A colleague might speak carelessly. A relative might become frightened and tell authorities. Planning demanded trust. And trust was one of the things surveillance made difficult. The border guards themselves lived inside a moral system of pressure. Many were young men. Some believed in the East German state. Some accepted the official explanation that they were protecting socialism from hostile forces. Some simply followed orders. Some feared punishment if they did not. And some faced moments when the abstractions disappeared. A person came running toward the border. Perhaps the runner was close to the same age as the guard. Perhaps the guard could see the fear on the person's face. Perhaps there were only seconds to decide. Raise the weapon. Shout. Fire. Miss deliberately. Hesitate. Obey. Disobey. History often reduces such moments to simple categories. But inside the moment, there could be fear on both sides. A person trying to escape knew that the guard might shoot. The guard knew that refusing an order could carry consequences. This does not make the system less cruel. It shows how a system can force ordinary people into terrible positions. The wall did not only imprison those trying to leave. It also shaped those ordered to defend it. Some border guards themselves escaped. They crossed while on duty. They fled during moments of opportunity. The famous leap of Konrad Schumann was only one example. The government responded by tightening control over its own guards. Units were watched. Loyalty was evaluated. Access was managed. The border needed guards who would not become escapees. This produced another layer of mistrust. The wall could not simply rely on concrete. It had to rely on human obedience. And human obedience could never be made as predictable as stone. Over the years, the number of successful escapes declined as the border system became more sophisticated. The early improvisation gave way to engineering. By the 1970s and 1980s, parts of the barrier had become highly standardized. Tall concrete segments formed the outer wall. A rounded pipe along the top made gripping difficult. Behind it stretched the controlled border zone. Observation towers gave guards wide fields of vision. Lighting reduced darkness. Patrol vehicles moved quickly along access roads. The system was meant to remove opportunities. It succeeded in making escape far more difficult. But it never removed the desire. That was the wall's central failure. A border can control bodies more easily than imagination. People still listened to Western radio. They still saw television broadcasts. They still heard stories from relatives. They still knew that another part of Berlin existed beyond the concrete. And some continued planning. Years could pass between the first idea and the final attempt. A person might slowly collect materials, learn how guards behaved, save money, build trust with a small group, wait for weather, wait for darkness, wait for a shift change, wait for courage. Then one night, the plan began. There is something profoundly quiet about many escape stories. The cinematic versions often emphasize action. Running feet, searchlights, engines, gunfire. But before those moments came long periods of silence. A family sewing fabric at night. A student moving soil in buckets. A mechanic altering a car behind a locked door. A swimmer studying a riverbank. A young person lying awake, rehearsing the route in the mind. The escape existed first as a secret carried through ordinary days. Breakfast, work, conversation, shopping, all while knowing that one hidden plan could change an entire life. And so the wall created two kinds of Berlin. The visible city above ground, where concrete and guard towers divided the map, and another invisible city beneath it and around it. A city of tunnels, passwords, hidden compartments, false documents, quiet signals, trusted friends, secret routes. This second Berlin never appeared on official maps, but it existed because the first one did. The stronger the barrier became, the more inventive the responses. The wall was built to end movement. Instead, it turned movement into resistance. Not everyone who escaped considered themselves a political dissident. Not everyone wanted to make a statement. Many wanted only a private life somewhere else. But authoritarian borders have a way of turning private choices into political acts. To choose where to live became a challenge. To visit family became a challenge. To leave became a challenge. And simply wanting to cross could make a person an enemy of the state. By the time the Berlin Wall had stood for years, it had become familiar enough that visitors sometimes treated it almost as an attraction. Western tourists photographed it. Politicians stood beside it. Graffiti spread across parts of its western face. Souvenir images circulated. But behind the photographs were people who lived with the consequences every day. People who knew exactly where a relative had once crossed. People who remembered a failed attempt. People who had spent time in prison. People who had escaped and left someone behind. People who waited years for permission to travel. People who learned that freedom could be measured in meters. And people who discovered that the hardest part of a wall was not always the concrete. Sometimes it was the silence around it. The fear of speaking. The suspicion that a conversation might be recorded. The uncertainty of whether a friend could be trusted. Because by the time the border reached its most developed form, East Germany had built another kind of wall as well. One without concrete. One that ran through offices, apartment buildings, universities, factories, friendships, marriages, and private thoughts. It was built from surveillance, from files, from informants, from the quiet knowledge that someone might be listening. And behind the visible wall of Berlin stood the invisible machinery of the Stasi. The most powerful walls are not always the ones people can see. In East Berlin, the concrete border stood in plain sight. It cut through streets. It interrupted railway lines. It separated neighborhoods. It cast long shadows beneath floodlights and watchtowers. But inside apartments, schools, factories, offices, churches, and friendships, another kind of border was forming. This one had no concrete, no barbed wire, no guard tower. It existed in hesitation, in lowered voices, in letters opened before they reached their destination, in questions left unasked, in the small pause before someone decided whether it was safe to speak honestly. The institution most associated with that atmosphere was the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Stasi had become one of the most extensive domestic surveillance systems in the world. Its official purpose was to protect the German Democratic Republic from enemies. Those enemies could be foreign intelligence services, political opponents, underground activists, people suspected of planning escape, religious groups, writers, artists, students, workers, or sometimes simply citizens who had said the wrong thing to the wrong person. The Stasi gathered information. It opened mail. It tapped telephones. It installed listening devices. It followed people. It photographed them. It kept files. And perhaps most importantly, it recruited informants. These informants were often ordinary people, a colleague, a neighbor, a university student, a factory worker, a church member, a relative, a friend. Sometimes they volunteered. Sometimes they believed they were defending the state. Sometimes they were pressured. Sometimes the authorities had information that could be used against them. Sometimes cooperation promised career advantages. The reasons varied. The result was the same. Private life became less private. Imagine an apartment in East Berlin on a winter evening. The curtains are closed. A family sits around a table. The radio is playing quietly. Perhaps the station is coming from West Berlin. Perhaps the father adjusts the volume downward before discussing politics. Perhaps the mother reminds the children not to repeat certain things at school. Perhaps no one says anything explicitly dangerous. Still, everyone understands that words can travel farther than intended. A joke might be repeated. A complaint about the government might be remembered. A conversation that feels harmless at home could look very different inside an official file. This did not mean that every East German lived in constant terror. That is too simple. Most days were ordinary. People went to work. Children attended school. Friends met for coffee. Families celebrated birthdays. Couples married. People listened to music. They watched television. They traveled on vacation within the countries available to them. They complained about food, bosses, neighbors, weather, and public transportation. They fell in love. They laughed. They raised children. They built careers. They found meaning in friendships, hobbies, and family life. A society under surveillance is still a society. People do not stop being human because the state is intrusive. That is important to remember. East Germany was not experienced by everyone in the same way. Some citizens believed sincerely in socialism. Some were proud of achievements in education, sports, employment, childcare, or social welfare. Some valued the sense of stability the system promised. Some participated willingly in state organizations. Some found real communities inside the system. Others disliked the government but learned to live around it. Some withdrew into private life. Some developed a quiet sense of irony. Some resisted openly. Many simply adapted. Adaptation is one of the oldest human skills. When a system lasts long enough, people learn its boundaries. They learn what can be said at work, what can be said at home, what can be joked about among trusted friends, what should never be written in a letter, what questions should not be asked in public. This is how political systems enter daily life, not only through laws, but through habits. The Stasi understood this very well. Its power did not depend only on arrests. It also depended on uncertainty. If people knew exactly who was informing, they could avoid those people. But when no one could be completely sure, suspicion spread more widely. That uncertainty was useful. A person did not need to know that the room was being monitored. It was enough to believe that it might be. A worker did not need proof that a colleague was reporting conversations. It was enough that the possibility existed. Fear could do part of the work by itself. The Stasi accumulated enormous quantities of paper, reports, photographs, transcripts, personal histories, records of relationships, travel requests, workplace evaluations, political observations. The bureaucracy of surveillance was vast. A person's life could be reduced to folders: where they worked, who they visited, what they wrote, which church they attended, whether they had relatives in the West, whether they listened to Western broadcasts, whether they had applied to leave the country, whether they had made comments considered hostile. The files often contained facts. They also contained interpretations, rumors, suspicions, errors. One informant's impression could become part of an official record, and official records could shape opportunities. A student might discover that entry to a university was difficult. A worker might be denied advancement. A person might be prevented from entering a sensitive profession. A travel application might be rejected. The reason was not always explained. Sometimes people understood. Sometimes they guessed. Sometimes they never knew. That uncertainty had its own weight. Imagine receiving a letter from a relative in West Germany. The envelope appears ordinary, but perhaps it has been opened. Perhaps it has been examined. Perhaps someone has recorded the contents. Perhaps nothing happened at all. You cannot know. So you read differently. You write your reply differently. You remove details. You avoid names. You do not say everything you want to say. The censor does not need to sit at the kitchen table. The possibility of censorship is already there. Radio and television created another strange dimension to life behind the wall. Despite attempts to control information, many East Germans could receive broadcasts from West Germany. Western television reached much of the country. Families watched entertainment, news, advertising, and political reporting from the other side. The state criticized such habits, but the signals crossed the border more easily than people could. This produced another paradox. A person could be forbidden from traveling to the West, but could watch the West from the living room. Bright advertisements showed products that might be unavailable locally. News programs described East German events in language very different from official broadcasts. Music traveled through the air. Ideas traveled through the air. The wall could stop bodies. It could not completely stop signals. For younger people, Western culture had particular appeal. Rock music, fashion, films, television. Popular culture arrived through radio waves, records, relatives, and illegal copying. The state alternated between restriction and limited accommodation. Authorities understood that banning everything people wanted often made those things more desirable. Young East Germans developed their own styles, their own private worlds, their own forms of humor. This was not always organized political resistance. Often it was simply youth. And youth has never been easy for governments to regulate. Across the wall, West Berlin developed in a completely different direction. It was an unusual city, geographically isolated, politically protected, economically supported, and culturally restless. West Berlin was surrounded by East Germany. To reach West Germany by land, travelers used designated routes across East German territory. The city's unusual status shaped almost everything. The Western powers maintained military forces there. The West German government subsidized the economy. Special incentives encouraged people to live and work in the city. For many young West Germans, Berlin also had a peculiar attraction. It was distant from the routines of the rest of the country. It had universities, artists, political activists, nightlife, music, theaters, cheap apartments in some neighborhoods, and a sense of being both central and isolated at the same time. West Berlin became famous for experimentation. Students protested, artists gathered, musicians performed. Political arguments filled cafes and university halls. The city could feel lively, rebellious, even chaotic. And yet the wall was never far away. Someone could leave a nightclub after midnight, walk several blocks, and arrive at a concrete border guarded from the other side. Neon lights and watchtowers existed in the same city. That contrast gave West Berlin a strange psychological intensity. Life could feel free. But the freedom was enclosed. The city was an island, protected by Western military power, surrounded by a state that claimed the city belonged to a different political future. The wall became part of the background. People gave directions using it. Children grew up near it. Artists painted on it from the western side. Tourists visited observation platforms. Political leaders stood beside it for photographs. And yet for many people, it remained painfully personal. A West Berliner might know that relatives lived only a few miles away in the east. A person could look across certain parts of the boundary and see apartment buildings that belonged to another world. Birthdays happened on both sides. Funerals happened on both sides. Children grew older. Parents became elderly. Years passed. For some families, legal visits eventually became possible through carefully controlled arrangements. But permission was never the same thing as freedom. A visit had dates, documents, rules, checkpoints, inspection. The emotional experience of crossing could be exhausting. At a checkpoint, an ordinary family journey became an encounter with the state. Passports were examined. Vehicles could be searched. Questions were asked. Travelers waited. The architecture itself encouraged obedience. Windows, booths, barriers, uniforms, signs. The message was unmistakable. Movement happened only because authority allowed it. For people in East Germany who applied to leave permanently, the consequences could be severe. Applications for exit visas could lead to pressure at work. Surveillance could intensify. Employment could become difficult. Social relationships might change. The applicant had announced in effect that they did not want to remain. The state could interpret that as disloyalty. Some people waited years. Some eventually received permission. Others were arrested for activities connected to their efforts to leave. Still others remained trapped between the desire to go and the fear of what an application might bring. This was another invisible wall. The wall inside decision-making. The moment when a person begins thinking not only, what do I want, but what will happen to my family if I say what I want. The Stasi became especially skilled in forms of psychological pressure. Not every opponent was imprisoned. In later decades, authorities sometimes used methods intended to disrupt a person's life without creating a dramatic public trial. Careers could be damaged. Relationships could be strained. Rumors could be planted. Mail could disappear. Plans could fail for reasons that seemed mysterious. A person might begin to feel that everything was going wrong. Sometimes, that was exactly the intention. Control did not always need a prison cell. It could operate through uncertainty. And yet people continued creating private spaces of trust. Families developed codes. Friends learned who could be relied upon. Church communities sometimes provided places where political discussion could occur with greater openness. Writers used metaphor. Musicians pushed boundaries. Jokes became a form of release. Humor was everywhere. Authoritarian systems often produce excellent political jokes because jokes allow people to say something true without delivering a formal speech. A joke could acknowledge shortages, bureaucracy, propaganda, the gap between official language and ordinary experience. People laughed because sometimes laughter was easier than confrontation. And because even under surveillance, life demanded more than fear. This balance matters. If East German history is described only through repression, the people living there disappear. They become shadows inside a political system. But they were not shadows. They had ambitions, annoyances, friendships, family traditions, favorite songs, jobs they liked, jobs they hated, places they loved, memories of childhood. Many East Germans later remembered parts of their former lives with affection while still rejecting the political restrictions of the state. History can hold both truths. A society can contain genuine human warmth inside an oppressive political structure. A person can miss a neighborhood without missing the government that controlled it. By the early 1980s, however, the pressure beneath East German stability was growing. The economy struggled with debt, aging infrastructure, and competition with the West. Consumer shortages remained frustrating. Environmental problems worsened in industrial areas. Younger generations had no memory of the founding ideals that had motivated some of their parents. The wall, once justified as temporary protection, had become permanent architecture. And permanent architecture creates permanent questions. Why does it still need to exist? Why are people still prevented from leaving? Why does a successful state require so much surveillance? Why must a government that claims to represent the people fear what those people might say? These questions did not always appear in public, but they accumulated inside churches, inside apartments, inside universities, inside private conversations, inside the files of the Stasi. The state knew that dissatisfaction existed. That was one reason it monitored society so closely. But surveillance has a weakness. It can tell a government that people are unhappy. It cannot always make them believe again. By the middle of the 1980s, change was beginning elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc. A new Soviet leader spoke about reform, about openness, about restructuring. Words that sounded cautious at first. Words that traveled slowly across borders. And then faster. East Germans listened. Some with hope. Some with suspicion. Some with fear. The wall still stood. The guards still watched. The Stasi still opened files. The checkpoints still operated. From a distance, the system looked solid. But inside the concrete, something had begun to shift. Not yet collapse. Not yet revolution. Only a small change in pressure. A crack too fine to see. And soon, that crack would begin to spread. By the middle of the 1980s, the Berlin Wall looked permanent. It had stood for more than 2 decades. Children had been born beside it, grown into adults, and begun raising children of their own. Concrete panels had been replaced and reinforced. Watchtowers still overlooked the border. Searchlights still illuminated the open strips at night. Guards still watched for movement. The Stasi still collected information. To anyone walking through Berlin, the division seemed to have become part of the landscape itself. And yet history was already moving beneath it. The first great change did not begin in Berlin. It began in Moscow. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. He inherited a superpower with immense military strength, but serious economic problems. The Soviet economy was stagnating. Technology lagged behind the West in important areas. The cost of maintaining a vast military establishment placed enormous pressure on the state. Gorbachev believed reform was necessary. 2 Russian words soon became known around the world: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. At first, these ideas were cautious. They did not mean that the Soviet leadership intended to abandon socialism. Gorbachev hoped to improve the system, not destroy it. But reform has consequences that cannot always be controlled. Once people are encouraged to speak more openly, They may say things their leaders do not want to hear. Once economic weaknesses are acknowledged, people may begin asking why those weaknesses have lasted so long. Once political systems begin changing in one country, people living in neighboring countries may begin asking why they cannot change as well. Across Eastern Europe, Gorbachev's reforms were watched carefully. In Poland, opposition movements grew stronger. In Hungary, reformers gained influence. In Czechoslovakia, dissidents continued pressing for political change. And in East Germany, the leadership watched with discomfort. The ruling Socialist Unity Party had little interest in copying Moscow's reforms. East German leader Erich Honecker belonged to an older generation. He had spent decades building and defending the state. To him and many around him, political stability depended on control. The East German government presented itself as economically successful, politically disciplined, and ideologically reliable. It did not believe it needed the same reforms as the Soviet Union. This created an extraordinary reversal. For decades, East Germany had followed Moscow. Now Moscow was changing, and East Berlin wanted to remain still. East German citizens noticed. They heard Gorbachev speak about openness. They saw changes taking place elsewhere. They watched Western television report debates that their own government preferred to minimize. A dangerous comparison returned. Not East against West this time, but East Germany against the changing socialist world around it. If the Soviet Union itself could discuss reform, why could East Germans not do the same? The question grew more urgent as the economy became more difficult. East Germany remained one of the more industrially developed countries in the Eastern Bloc. But appearances could hide weaknesses. Infrastructure was aging. Factories often relied on outdated equipment. Environmental damage in industrial regions was serious. Consumer goods remained less abundant than in West Germany. The state borrowed heavily and struggled to maintain living standards while financing an enormous administrative and security apparatus. People could see the difference between official claims and everyday experience. A government poster might celebrate industrial achievement. A family might still wait years for a new automobile. A television broadcast might praise economic progress. A shopper might still find that certain goods were unavailable. These frustrations alone did not bring down the system, but they added to a deeper problem. People wanted choice. Travel became one of the most sensitive issues. By the late 1980s, many East Germans had grown tired of living in a country that restricted their ability to leave. For older citizens, the wall might have become familiar. For younger people, it could feel like an inheritance they had never agreed to accept. They had not built it. They had not experienced the instability of the early Cold War. They simply knew that it stood between them and another part of Europe. Then, in 1989, events began moving faster. Hungary became crucial. The Hungarian government was introducing reforms and loosening some elements of its border controls. In May 1989, Hungarian authorities began dismantling parts of the physical barrier along the border with Austria. The images were powerful. Officials cutting through fences. Sections of the Iron Curtain being removed. For East Germans, the geography was obvious. If they could legally travel to Hungary, and if Hungary's border with Austria was becoming easier to cross, then perhaps there was a route to the west that did not pass through the Berlin Wall. During the summer, increasing numbers of East Germans traveled to Hungary. Some went on vacation. Others went with a different plan. They packed carefully. They brought children. They carried documents. They waited near the Austrian border. Some crossed illegally. Others waited for political decisions that might allow them through. In August, a symbolic event known as the Pan-European Picnic took place near the Hungarian-Austrian border. A temporary opening was arranged as part of a political demonstration. Hundreds of East Germans used the opportunity to cross into Austria. The border that had once seemed sealed was beginning to behave differently. Then, in September, Hungary opened its western border to East German refugees more broadly. The effect was dramatic. Thousands moved through Hungary into Austria, and from there toward West Germany. The Berlin Wall still stood. But suddenly, it was no longer the only route out. The East German government faced the same problem that had haunted it before 1961. People were leaving. Only now, the crisis was unfolding across an entire region. Other East Germans traveled to Czechoslovakia and sought refuge in the West German embassy in Prague. The embassy grounds became crowded. Families arrived with bags and children. People slept in difficult conditions. The number of refugees grew. They wanted permission to travel to West Germany. Diplomatic negotiations followed. Eventually, arrangements were made allowing many of them to leave. The scenes were extraordinary. Crowds packed railway stations. People cheered. Trains carried refugees through East German territory toward the west. In some places, East Germans tried to board the trains as they passed. Police intervened. The state was losing control of movement again. And this time, simply building another wall would not solve the problem. Inside East Germany, protest was also growing. Leipzig became one of the most important centers. For years, the Nikolaikirche, or St. Nicholas Church, had hosted prayers for peace. Churches in East Germany occupied a complicated position. They existed inside the socialist state but retained a degree of institutional independence. This made some church spaces important meeting places for people interested in peace, environmental issues, human rights, and political reform. On Monday evenings, people gathered. At first, the crowds were small. Then they grew. After the prayer meetings, demonstrators began moving into the streets. They called for reform, for freedom of travel, for political rights, and increasingly, they shouted a phrase that would become one of the defining slogans of the revolution. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. The words were simple. That was what made them powerful. The East German state claimed to represent the people. The demonstrators answered by claiming the word for themselves. We are the people, not the party, not the bureaucracy, not the security service, us. The crowds grew from thousands to tens of thousands. The government faced a choice. It could negotiate, it could retreat, or it could use force. The possibility of violence was real. Only months earlier, in June 1989, the Chinese government had violently suppressed demonstrations around Tiananmen Square in Beijing. East German leaders were aware of what had happened. So were the protesters. The question hung over Leipzig. Would East German security forces do the same? On October 9, 1989, a huge demonstration formed in Leipzig. Around 70,000 people took to the streets. Hospitals had prepared for casualties. Security forces were present. People carried candles. The symbolism was striking. A candle requires two hands if you want to shield the flame. Hands holding candles are not holding weapons. The protesters moved through the city. They chanted. They waited. Security forces did not launch a major attack. The demonstration remained largely peaceful. That night changed the psychology of the crisis. The state had faced a massive crowd, and it had not crushed it. For years, fear had helped preserve the system. Now fear began changing sides. Citizens understood that large numbers could matter. Officials understood that orders might not be obeyed forever. The demonstrations continued. They grew. Meanwhile, the East German leadership appeared increasingly disconnected from events. The government celebrated the 40th anniversary of the German Democratic Republic in October 1989. Mikhail Gorbachev visited East Berlin. Crowds saw him as a symbol of reform. Some openly called for his help. The contrast was impossible to miss. The Soviet leader appeared more willing to discuss change than the East German government that had long depended on Soviet support. Gorbachev made clear that Moscow would not simply preserve the old order at any cost. The message was subtle but enormous. For decades, the memory of Soviet military intervention had hung over Eastern Europe. In East Germany in 1953, in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968. When communist governments faced serious threats, Soviet tanks had once been the final answer. Now that answer was uncertain. Without the guarantee of Soviet force, the East German leadership was far more vulnerable. On October 18th, Erich Honecker was removed from power. He was replaced by Egon Krenz. The leadership hoped a change of face might restore control. It did not. People wanted more than a different leader. They wanted change. On November 4th, hundreds of thousands gathered in East Berlin at Alexanderplatz. It was one of the largest demonstrations in East German history. Speakers demanded political reform, freedom of expression, and accountability. The remarkable thing was no longer that people were dissatisfied. The remarkable thing was that they were saying so openly, in enormous numbers, in the capital of the state. The wall remained physically intact. Politically, however, it was becoming harder to defend. The government began working on new travel regulations. Officials understood that the restrictions could not continue in their existing form. The question was how to loosen them without losing complete control. Committees drafted rules. Documents were revised. The bureaucracy attempted to manage a revolution with paperwork. And then came November 9th, 1989. The day began without any clear sign that the wall would open that night. Officials met. New travel regulations were discussed. The plan was to allow East German citizens to apply for private travel abroad under more relaxed conditions. There were procedures, applications, administrative details. The intention was not to throw open the border immediately without control. But late that afternoon and evening, information moved through the government in a confused way. Günter Schabowski, a senior East German official, prepared to speak at an international press conference. He had been given a document about the new travel rules. He had not been fully briefed on every detail. The press conference was televised. Journalists asked questions. Near the end, Schabowski mentioned the new regulations. A reporter asked when they would take effect. Schabowski looked through his papers. He hesitated. Then he gave an answer that would become one of the most famous mistakes in modern political history. As far as he knew, he said, the regulation took effect immediately, without delay. The words traveled faster than the bureaucracy could correct them. Western news agencies reported that East Germany was opening its borders. Television broadcasts repeated the announcement. East Germans watched from their homes. They heard that the travel restrictions had changed. They heard that the border was open. And they did what people do when they are told a locked door has been unlocked. They went to the door. At border crossings across Berlin, crowds began gathering. At first, the numbers were manageable. People approached guards and asked to cross. The guards had not received clear instructions. They called superiors. The answers were uncertain. Wait. Do not open. Control the situation. But the crowd kept growing. More people arrived. They had seen the news. They had heard the announcement. They believed they had been given permission. At Bornholmer Strasse in northern Berlin, the pressure became especially intense. The crossing was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Harold Jaeger. He and his men tried to follow orders. But the orders did not match reality. Thousands of people were arriving. They were not armed. They were not attacking. They were simply demanding the right they believed their own government had just announced. The guards faced an impossible problem. To stop the crowd permanently might require force. Force could mean bloodshed. No one wanted to become the person who ordered shooting on a night when the government itself seemed to have told people they could travel. Telephone calls continued. Instructions remained inadequate. The crowd grew louder. The pressure increased. And sometime before midnight, the checkpoint at Bornholmer Strasse opened. People began crossing. At first, perhaps cautiously, then in greater numbers. East Berliners moved into West Berlin. West Berliners greeted them. People cried. They laughed. They embraced strangers. Cars sounded their horns. Champagne appeared. The wall had not yet been demolished. The German Democratic Republic had not yet vanished. Germany had not yet been reunified. But something irreversible had happened. The border had opened, and a structure designed for decades to prevent movement had failed in a few hours because the people guarding it no longer knew how to justify keeping the gates closed. For 28 years, the wall had been concrete, steel, orders, paperwork, fear, and discipline. On the night of November 9th, 1989, all of those things remained physically present. The towers were still there. The barriers were still there. The guards were still there. The guns were still there. But authority had begun to evaporate. And without authority, the wall was only concrete. By midnight, Berlin was no longer asking whether the border would open. People were already walking through it. The city that had gone to sleep, divided in August 1961, was now staying awake to watch the division dissolve. On the night of November 9th, 1989, Berlin did not fall silent. It became louder. Car horns echoed through the streets. People shouted from open windows. Strangers embraced beneath streetlights. Champagne bottles were passed from hand to hand. Some laughed. Some cried. Some simply stood still, staring at a border they had spent most of their lives believing would never open. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall had divided a city. Now, almost without warning, people were walking through it. At Bornholmer Strasse, the first large opening had already begun. Border guards who had spent years checking documents and enforcing restrictions suddenly watched thousands of people pass. The transformation was almost surreal. A checkpoint designed to slow movement had become a floodgate. People arrived carrying identification papers because they still expected some kind of procedure. They had been trained to expect forms, stamps, questions, permission, but soon the system could no longer process the crowds. Families crossed together. Young people ran. Older people moved more carefully. Some stepped into West Berlin and stopped, as if they needed a moment to understand what had happened. They had crossed a line that, only hours earlier, could have brought arrest or worse. Now, no one was stopping them. Other checkpoints began opening as well. At Invalidenstraße, at Heinrich-Heine-Straße, at Checkpoint Charlie. At various crossings across the divided city, the same pressure repeated itself. Crowds gathered. Guards telephoned superiors. Instructions remained confused. Then gates opened. The wall had not physically disappeared, but its meaning had changed. That distinction is important. A wall is not powerful because it is made of concrete. Concrete alone cannot command anyone. A border becomes powerful when institutions agree to enforce it, when guards obey orders, when citizens fear consequences, when documents are required, when governments insist that a line must not be crossed. On the night of November 9th, those invisible supports began collapsing faster than the concrete itself. And once that happened, the wall became strangely fragile. People climbed onto it. At the Brandenburg Gate, crowds gathered near one of the most famous symbols of Berlin. For decades, the gate had stood near the border, trapped inside the divided landscape. Now, people approached from both directions. Young men and women pulled themselves onto the top of the wall. They sat together above the concrete. They waved. They sang. They shouted. Some raised their arms toward television cameras. Below them, border guards who once would have prevented such scenes now seemed uncertain what role they were supposed to play. The images traveled around the world. Television viewers in London watched. Families in Paris watched. People in New York watched. People in Moscow watched. People across Eastern Europe watched. A structure that had symbolized the Cold War for nearly 3 decades was being occupied by ordinary civilians. No army had defeated it. No tanks had broken through. No artillery had destroyed the border fortifications. People simply climbed onto it. That simplicity gave the moment its power. In West Berlin, the atmosphere became a spontaneous festival. Bars remained open. Restaurants filled. Music played. West Berliners welcomed visitors from the East, sometimes offering drinks, food, flowers, or simply directions through a part of the city that many East Berliners had not seen for decades. West German authorities provided arriving East Germans with a traditional welcome payment, known as Begrüßungsgeld. Banks and offices were overwhelmed. Shops filled with visitors curious about products they had previously seen only through Western television or heard about from relatives. For some, the first night in West Berlin was not political at all. It was sensory. Bright shop windows, advertisements, traffic, food, music, streetlights, the overwhelming abundance of things. People wandered through department stores simply looking. They bought bananas, records, clothing, coffee, or small souvenirs. Some purchased nothing. They only wanted to see. This was one of the strangest features of the night. One of the defining moments of 20th century political history was also filled with very ordinary acts. Buying a drink, calling a relative, taking a subway ride, walking down a street, standing in front of a shop window. Freedom often arrives in history books as a grand idea. That night, for many Berliners, it arrived as the ability to go somewhere without asking. At telephone booths, people called family members. Some had relatives in the West, whom they had not seen for years. News spread through personal networks faster than anyone could organize. A brother called a sister. A daughter called her parents. A friend knocked on another friend's door. Come outside. The border is open. You can cross. Not everyone believed it immediately. After 28 years, disbelief had become reasonable. Some East Berliners remained at home, convinced the opening might be temporary or that the announcement had been misunderstood. Others feared that the authorities might reverse the decision. Some thought they should wait until morning. But as television images showed crowds crossing without being arrested, doubt gave way to movement. More people came. The next day, Berlin was transformed. The wall still stood across much of the city, but crowds gathered along it. People brought hammers, chisels, tools. They began striking the concrete. Small fragments broke free. These people became known as Mauer Spekta, wall woodpeckers. They chipped pieces from the barrier as souvenirs. The act was symbolic, but deeply personal. For years, touching the wall from the eastern side could be dangerous. Now, people were taking pieces home in their pockets. A structure once designed to control human movement was becoming memorabilia. Bits of gray concrete appeared on shelves, desks, and mantels. Some would later be sold around the world. Others would remain in family homes, attached to a memory of a night when something impossible became ordinary. Formal demolition took much longer. The wall was an enormous border system extending around West Berlin. Removing it required machinery, workers, engineering, and political decisions. Large sections remained standing for months. But psychologically, the wall had already fallen. That phrase, the fall of the Berlin Wall, describes something more than physical destruction. It describes the loss of authority. On November 8th, the border could determine a person's life. On November 10th, people were walking through it by the thousands. The concrete had barely moved. The world around it had. East Germany now entered a period of astonishing change. The demonstrations continued. Political parties reorganized. Opposition groups emerged openly. The old ruling system weakened rapidly. The Stasi itself became a target of public anger. Citizens feared that security officials might destroy records documenting decades of surveillance. In several cities, people occupied Stasi offices. They wanted the files preserved. They wanted evidence protected. They wanted to know what had been done in their names, and in many cases, to them personally. The files would later become one of the most painful legacies of East German history. After reunification, many people gained access to records that had been kept about their lives. Some discovered that close acquaintances had informed on them. Some found reports written by colleagues. Some learned that a trusted friend had passed conversations to the authorities. In certain cases, spouses or relatives had cooperated with the Stasi. The fall of a political system did not erase the emotional consequences of surveillance. Sometimes it revealed them. A person could celebrate freedom and discover betrayal in the same year. This was part of the complicated aftermath. Political liberation could happen quickly. Memory moved more slowly. The question of German reunification also emerged with extraordinary speed. At first, not everyone assumed East and West Germany would immediately become one country. The opening of the wall meant freedom of movement. It did not automatically determine the political future. Some East German reformers hoped to build a more democratic version of East Germany. Others wanted rapid reunification with the Federal Republic. Foreign governments had their own concerns. Germany had been divided partly because of the catastrophe of the Second World War. A reunified Germany would once again become one of the largest and most powerful countries in Europe. Britain, France, the Soviet Union, the United States, Poland, and other European states all had historical and strategic interests in what happened next. The memory of German militarism was not distant history. It was living memory. Yet events moved quickly. In March 1990, East Germany held its first and only free parliamentary election. Parties favoring rapid reunification performed strongly. Economic pressures intensified. East Germans increasingly demanded access not only to political freedom, but to the stronger West German economy and currency. On July 1, 1990, monetary union brought the West German Deutsche Mark into East Germany. The economic integration was dramatic. For many people, it was exciting. For others, it was destabilizing. Businesses that had operated within the protected socialist economy suddenly faced competition from Western companies. Some factories could not survive. Jobs disappeared. Institutions were reorganized. Careers built over decades became uncertain. The old system had restricted people, but it had also structured their lives. When that structure disappeared, freedom came together with disorientation. This is one reason the story should not end with the celebration on the wall. History rarely stops at the moment people cheer. The morning after freedom begins, people still need jobs, homes, schools, pensions, laws, institutions, a sense of who they are. For East Germans, the collapse of the old state meant liberation from dictatorship. It also meant the disappearance of an entire social world. Street names changed. Organizations vanished. Workplaces closed or were privatized. Qualifications were reevaluated. The symbols people had grown up with were removed. Some welcomed every change. Others experienced a strange form of loss, not necessarily for the political system itself, but for the familiar world in which their lives had taken place. Years later, Germans would use the word Nostalgie to describe a certain nostalgia for aspects of life in the former East. The term could refer to products, television programs, everyday objects, childhood memories, food, cars, jokes. The phenomenon was sometimes misunderstood as longing for dictatorship. Often it was something more complicated. People can reject a government and still miss their youth. They can condemn surveillance and still remember neighbors with affection. They can welcome freedom and still grieve the disappearance of a familiar life. On October 3rd, 1990, less than 11 months after the border opened, Germany was formally reunified. East Germany ceased to exist as a separate state. Its territory joined the Federal Republic of Germany. Berlin was reunited politically as well. The city that had spent 45 years divided by Allied occupation and Cold War rivalry began becoming one capital again. The speed was breathtaking. In 1945, Germany had been conquered and divided. In 1949, two German states had formed. In 1961, the Berlin Wall had risen. In November 1989, the border opened. And by October 1990, the political division of Germany was over. Few people standing beside the barbed wire on August 13, 1961, could have imagined how the story would end. Fewer still could have guessed that the final opening would involve no major battle. The wall had been built during a crisis between superpowers. It survived nuclear confrontation. Presidents came and went. Soviet leaders changed. Wars were fought elsewhere. Generations grew older. And then one evening, a confused answer at a press conference helped send thousands of ordinary people toward border crossings. The guards hesitated. The gates opened. History changed direction. In the years that followed, much of the wall was removed. Roads were reconnected. Railway lines were restored. Ghost stations reopened. Neighborhoods once separated by concrete became connected again. Construction cranes filled Berlin. Empty areas along the former border became building sites. Potsdamer Platz, once a wasteland beside the wall, was transformed into a major urban center. The city began covering the physical wound. But it did not erase the memory. Sections of the wall were preserved. At the East Side Gallery, surviving concrete became a canvas for artists. Memorials were built. Museums collected photographs, escape equipment, documents, and personal stories. At Bernauer Strasse, visitors can still see how the border divided buildings, sidewalks, streets, and lives. A line of stones marks parts of the former route through the modern city. Today, someone can cross that line without noticing. A cyclist passes. A child walks to school. A couple carries groceries. Cars move through intersections that were once barricaded. The ordinary life that the wall interrupted has returned. And perhaps that is one of the most moving things about Berlin today. The absence of the wall is visible in how little attention people need to give the places where it once stood. Freedom can look surprisingly uneventful. A street continues. A train stops at the next station. A person crosses a bridge. No guard asks why. No document is examined. No family needs permission to meet. The most extraordinary achievement can become ordinary life. But the wall left other traces that were harder to remove. Economic differences between Eastern and Western Germany did not disappear with reunification. Neither did differences in political attitudes, family experiences, wealth, employment patterns, or memory. The division had lasted too long for that. People had lived under different institutions for 4 decades. They had watched different news, attended different schools, worked in different economic systems, learned different assumptions about the state. A border can be removed from a map much faster than it can be removed from memory. And so the history of the Berlin Wall did not truly end in 1989. It continued inside families, inside politics, inside architecture, inside the way Germans remembered the 20th century. Even the question of how many people died trying to cross the Berlin border remains connected to careful historical research, because individual cases were hidden, misreported, or disputed. What is not disputed is the human cost. People were killed attempting escape. Others drowned. Others died during border incidents. Thousands were imprisoned for trying to leave East Germany. Families were separated. Careers were destroyed. People spent years waiting for permissions that might never come. The wall had consequences far beyond those captured in its most famous photographs. And yet the final memory of the wall is not only one of suffering, it is also the memory of its failure. That may be why the story remains so powerful. The wall looked permanent. It was engineered to endure. It was defended by one of the most heavily monitored states in Europe. Behind it stood the military power of the Soviet bloc. For decades, political leaders on both sides treated Berlin's division as an almost fixed reality. And then the assumptions supporting that reality began to disappear. Hungary opened a border. People fled through embassies. Churches filled. Candles appeared in Leipzig. Crowds marched. A government lost confidence. A Soviet leader refused to rescue the old order with tanks. A bureaucratic announcement was mishandled. Thousands of people approached checkpoints. And men carrying weapons chose not to turn a political error into a massacre. The wall did not fall because of one person. It did not fall because of one speech. It did not fall because of one protest. It fell because many pressures accumulated until the system protecting it could no longer function. Diplomacy mattered. Economic weakness mattered. Gorbachev's reforms mattered. Hungarian decisions mattered. Polish political change mattered. East German protesters mattered. Refugees mattered. Journalists mattered. Officials made mistakes. Border guards made choices. And ordinary people kept arriving at the gates. History is often like that. We remember one dramatic night because a dramatic night is easy to picture. But beneath that night lie years of smaller decisions. Private doubts. Quiet conversations. Failed escape attempts. Letters. Demonstrations. Economic frustrations. Political reforms. Acts of courage that did not appear on television. The final collapse looks sudden only because the cracks were hidden for so long. And now, if we return to Berlin after midnight on November 9th, 1989, perhaps we can see the story most clearly. Imagine standing near the wall. The November air is cold. There are thousands of people around you. Someone is laughing. Someone is crying. Someone has climbed onto the concrete. A bottle passes through the crowd. Television lights shine against faces. A hammer strikes the wall. Once. Then again. A small piece of concrete falls away. For 28 years, this structure told people where they could go. It separated parents from children. It turned neighbors into foreigners. It taught guards to watch citizens. It transformed streets into borders. It became the clearest physical symbol of a world divided between two nuclear superpowers. And now a stranger places a piece of it in a coat pocket. The wall is becoming an object again. Nothing more. Concrete. Stone. Dust. That may be the deepest lesson of its story. No wall is only concrete. A wall is also a belief. A belief that one group must be kept apart from another. A belief that movement must be controlled. A belief that fear can become permanent. A belief that people will eventually accept what they are forbidden to change. For a long time, those beliefs seemed stronger than the people living beneath them. But they were not. In the end, the Berlin Wall did not disappear because history suddenly became simple. It disappeared because the world around it changed, until the wall no longer made sense, even to many of the people expected to defend it. And perhaps that is why its ruins still speak so quietly. They remind us that even the most permanent-looking systems are made by human beings. They are maintained by human beings. And one day, they can be changed by human beings. Berlin survived the war. It survived occupation. It survived blockade. It survived division. It survived tanks facing one another across a checkpoint. It survived barbed wire, concrete, watchtowers, escape tunnels, secret police, and nearly 3 decades of separation. And then, on one cold November night, the city began to become a city again. People crossed. They embraced. They walked streets that had been forbidden. They stood beneath the Brandenburg Gate. They touched the wall, and slowly, beneath the noise of celebration, an era came to an end. The Cold War would not disappear that night. The Soviet Union would survive for 2 more years. Europe would still face difficult transitions. Germany would still have years of reunification ahead. But something fundamental had changed. The most famous border in the divided world had opened. And once Berlin could no longer be held apart, the old map of Europe could not remain unchanged for very long. Today, much of the wall is gone. The watchtowers have mostly vanished. The death strip has been absorbed into parks, roads, buildings, and ordinary neighborhoods. The checkpoints belong to museums and memory. But if you walk through Berlin quietly enough, you can still follow the line. And perhaps, for a moment, imagine what it once meant. A few steps. One side. The other. A distance that now takes seconds. A distance that once contained an entire world. And that is the complete story of the Berlin Wall. A wall built from fear, maintained through control, challenged by imagination, weakened by change, and finally opened by people who decided to walk toward it. For nearly 3 decades, it stood as if it might remain forever. And then, one night, it did not. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of tonight's story here on Ancient Stories to Sleep. If this quiet journey through history helped you relax, learn something new, or drift a little closer to sleep, please consider supporting the channel with a like and a subscription. Your support helps us continue creating long, peaceful documentaries for those who find comfort in the stories of the past. And if you know someone who might enjoy falling asleep to history, feel free to share this episode with them. Until our next journey together, rest well, sleep peacefully, and let the echoes of history fade gently into the night. Good night, and thank you for listening.